Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
Jessica didn't want to go to the notary, especially since Brian's got no one to leave him with. 7 years old. He's a young fiance, but he's still scared. Where are we going? The store or the park? That's where I'd like to go. There are squirrels, ducks, wild swans, Brian asked on the way. Jessica smiled. No, son, we're going to my uncle the notary for Grandpa Matthew's inheritance. But my dad's. Oh, I see. Well, not really, of course. Is Grandpa Matthew already in heaven? Brian asked again. Jessica shrugged. I guess so. Never did anything bad to anyone. Helped orphanages, homeless animals. Brian nodded in agreement, but he continued the conversation. And his grandfather made homeless dogs with these collars yellow. But it means that the dog is vaccinated, does not pose a threat to people. And he doesn't just walk around town, he walks near the shelter. Brian thought dreamily, imagining that someday he would have a dog of his own. Jessica, on the other hand, was thinking about something else, about her upcoming conversation with the notary. What could she possibly learn there? Especially when her daddy wouldn't come back, and that was the most painful topic for her. Why does she need all this business now? Especially since she had always dreamed of linking her life with a beauty salon, or at the very least, a restaurant. And here is a construction company, its own peculiarities, many of which remained unclear to her. On the other hand, there's no escape. You have to enter into the rites. That's the procedure. And what a bad time it was. One thing on top of another, like a series of troubles. Then there's the divorce from Eden. The husband has shown his true colors. No sooner had Daddy gone than he took a mistress. Openly, brazenly. He wouldn't do that in Matthew's time. He was afraid. It's understandable. A lot of people were afraid of Matthew. What's character alone? And his business acumen. He'd take a man by the throat as well as any opponent. But all in good time. A month ago, Matthew died, and Jessica and her stepmother Kayla learned the tragic news. A sudden heart attack, overwork, business trips, negotiations, and endless business trips. All for home, all for family. Jessica sighed sadly and crossed to the other side of the street, where the notary's office was actually located. At the best of times she could have used a car, but at the moment she had no such option. Shortly before Matthew's tragic passing, his previously established business had suffered a setback. Jessica had to sell her car to help her father to pay off his debts. Of course, she didn't regret selling the car. Without it, she could live quite normally. And it wasn't the main thing. Jessica was brought out of her sad thoughts by Brian's voice. Mommy, look, there's Daddy's car. The red one, the one that. Jessica flinched and looked in that direction. That's right, Eden's foreign car. He never spared money to buy them. He liked to live lavishly. Who's embarrassed? He used to be afraid of his father-in-law, but now he's not afraid of anything. Ignoring her son's remark, Jessica started up the stairs. Brian followed obediently, still not fully understanding what was going on. But when Jessica opened the door of the notary's office, she was stunned to see her Eden standing in front of her, embraced by another long-legged beauty. Jessie was here, and here we are like a Christmas tree, early riser, early riser. I can see that. It's a good idea to get up at someone else's expense, said Jessica. Eden sniffed resentfully. Why should it be at someone else's expense? Your father left me something too. I've lived with you for 5 years. More like lived. Yeah, well, it doesn't matter. So your daddy decided to thank me for putting up with his no-good daughter for so many years. My mom's not a bad mom, but you're a traitor, Brian exclaimed and stomped his foot angrily. Eden smirked. He's growing up to be a protector. I told you from the start, kids from the orphanage will never be family. Jessica gave her husband a hateful look. Who's pulling your tongue? Don't you have anyone to talk to? Brian is my son, period. I don't care what you think. But it's your business, and I always speak my mind. Know that you and your daddy were playing spy, thinking up combinations. So you did, Eden said with undisguised irony. His companion hummed in agreement and gave Jessica a scornful look. How dare you talk about my father like that? If it weren't for him, you'd still be working as a construction laborer. Who made you foreman? Who taught you everything? Jessica exclaimed. The situation in the notary's office was getting heated, and the conversation was about to turn into a real scandal at any moment. At that moment, the door of the office opened, and the elderly notary took the role of umpire. Citizens stopped quarreling. I dare say that the notary's office is the least suitable for such scenes, although I understand the condition of both parties. Therefore, to avoid further and unnecessary speculations, I will say everything at once. Matthew Skorobogatov left his entire business and financial assets to Eden Prudnikov and the deceased's wife, Kayla Starbogatova. Jessica has left all real estate, including a beach house. Out of surprise, Jessica froze in place like a dumbfounded woman. Apparently, the experienced notary had deliberately laid out everything at once in order to put an end to family squabbles in one fell swoop. What do you mean all the business and assets? To whom? To that womanizer and philanderer, Jessica exclaimed, her cheeks flushed with excitement. You must mean you, sweetheart. You're nothing now. And my Eden is a rich heir, Olivia said. Eden grinned and looked at his ex-wife defiantly. They weren't technically separated yet, but it was only a matter of time. Her father's premature departure had prevented Jessica from realizing what she'd planned. She had wanted to divorce Eden 6 months ago, but it never came to fruition. It was one thing or the other. But by that time, they were no longer living together, and everyone realized that they would never have a strong family relationship. And now Jessica found out that her beloved father left all his savings to Eden. That's unthinkable. What was the dead businessman's motive? He couldn't do that to his daughter, could he? Maybe Matthew was hypnotized, or worse, coerced. Jessica didn't know the answer to that question. Jessica, why don't you say something? You're entitled to something too. Your late father has not forgotten about you, said the notary's voice. Jessica looked up and met the older man's gaze. What am I owed? Paul adjusted his horn-rimmed glasses on his nose and answered in an impartial tone. You will be given a house in the village of Michaelville, along with the surrounding land and outbuildings. And there was a tense pause in the office. It seemed that even the secretary had stopped tapping on the keyboard. At first, Jessica thought she had misheard and misunderstood Paul's words. But when she asked again, her mood sank. God, what was my father thinking when he made his will? Raced through the young woman's mind, not realizing which cabin she was referring to. Brian clung to his mom and looked at everyone present in a huff. Are you happy with your inheritance? Did Daddy please you or not? Eden asked with a sneer. He did, Eden. I'm sure he did, Jessica said in a shaky voice. Her ex-husband smirked. You probably haven't even seen that house. I have. It was a sight to behold. I'll tell you, the house was just about to fall apart like a house of cards. Caution in the yard, well, not unlike our inheritance. But I'm glad you like it. All right, let's go, Jessica said in a shaky voice, and taking the package with the deed and keys from the notary's desk, she left the office with Brian. On the street, she covered her face with her hands and cried softly. What are you doing? Why are you crying? Is everything okay? Or are you upset because of this house? The baby asked anxiously. Jessica shook her head sadly. What could she say to her son that his grandfather had left them without an inheritance? Yes, she couldn't even believe it herself. How could a little child get into that? Jessica was sure her daddy was going to leave his estate to her. And he even gave his real estate to Kayla. She lived with him for 10 years? Not very long, if you ask me. She waited her time. What's she and Brian gonna do? Jessica couldn't live with her stepmother. And it was Kayla's fault she didn't like her stepdaughter at first sight. Jessica had never sought conflict with the femme fatale. If her father chose her, he knew what he was doing. He was guided by something. So after living in Matthew's house for about a year, Kayla began to gradually establish her own rules. First, she forced Jessica out of the kitchen, preventing her from cooking. I'm sorry, darling, but I'm bored with your cooking. Why stand at the stove 24 hours a day when you can pay for restaurant delivery? Kayla said, letting Jessica know that her presence was unwelcome. Jessica looked hopefully at her dad, but he pretended not to notice and continued to do what he was very good, running his business. Jessica, on the other hand, was in charge of his charities and helping anyone in need. She didn't remember the road from the notary's office very well. What was she thinking? What was she planning? No one could tell but herself. Brian obediently walked beside her, trying not to bother his mother with questions. The clever boy realized that something strange had happened this morning that would change their lives beyond recognition. And when Jessica opened the door to her parents' house, she felt uneasy. The thing was that in the living room, she saw a strange man in his 50s, with whom her stepmother was talking like a lovebird. And after all, it had only been a month since her father had left. But how could this be? Insolent, cynical. No respect for the feelings of the deceased. When she saw Jessica, Kayla struggled to suppress a snide grin. For a moment she thought her stepmother knew about the will, and that's why she was acting so brazen and defiant. Look, she's built a romantic rendezvous here. Wine, a dish from the restaurant on the table. I guess the inheritance is impressive, Jessica thought. Then she added, turning to Brian. Son, we're leaving. Pack your things in your backpack, and I'll take care of the suitcases. The boy looked at his mom in surprise. Leaving? Where to? Michaelville Township, where Grandpa left us an inheritance. Well, what else is there to do? Jessica replied in a shaky voice. Brian nodded, and then ran to his room to pack. Are you guys going somewhere? Kayla asked in a slightly surprised voice. Yeah, we're leaving. There's nothing more to do here. Oh, is there anything I can do for you? Maybe call a cab? Or something? The stepmother persisted. No, thanks. Am I so stupid that I can't call my own cab? Jessica snapped at her. It took them about half an hour to pack. Jessica felt like she was being mean to herself and to the circumstances that forced her to look at the situation from a different angle. She had thought her father would leave her the business and all the financial assets. That's what everyone does. All best for the children and grandchildren. But here everything went in a completely different scenario. Instead of helping his own daughter, Matthew gave everything to his deadbeat son-in-law. Maybe it's because he always wanted a son, so he saw Eden as his successor. He couldn't think of a worse candidate for that role. Chasing the sad thoughts away, Jessica picked up her suitcase and headed for the exit, where an elderly cab driver in an unremarkable yellow foreign car was waiting for them. "We're going to Michaelville, please. I'll give you the number." "Okay, sure. Have a seat, please." "I'll make it all right," the driver fussed. Jessica nodded and got into the back passenger seat with Brian. She knew where the village she wanted was, about 30 kilometers from the city. A river, a small forest, and vast fields where the local farmers' land spread out. Brian nestled his face against the window, watching the road. And every time a huge truck drove by, he ahead in delight. In truth, the kid had never been out of town before, so his amazement was so genuine that Jessica couldn't help but smile. "Are you going to Mikhailovsky at all, or are you just visiting?" the cab driver asked. Jessica shrugged uncertainly. "I don't know, as it turns out. Maybe for good." The driver exclaimed in amazement. "I've been there many times. You can't find a better place for recreation, mushrooms, fishing, and the land is such that everything grows, no matter what you plant, honestly. And we're not really tied to the land. I studied pedagogy." "But I never worked a day at school," Jessica said, embarrassed. "My dad wanted to make a businesswoman out of me, but it didn't work out. But it's fixable. It's just a matter of will, as they say." "Yeah, it's okay. We'll come and see, and then we'll see," Jessica summarized. The road ran away like a ribbon fluttering in the wind. There was a turn here, a fork there. They didn't reach the village until the afternoon. The locals met the unremarkable cab car warily, and after all, the settlement was relatively small, and every new guest was an occasion for discussion and detailed scrutiny. So when Jessica saw the same type of local houses with stone roofs and small windows, she was visibly dejected. But she had imagined it a little differently. Dogs roamed the yards, and geese lazily nibbled at the grass. Skinny chickens pecked at their feed, in no hurry to get anywhere. When the cab driver called the right house number, Jessica froze with surprise. Eden hadn't been lying when he'd said the house looked old and dilapidated from years of neglect. "What, are we going to live here now?" Brian asked in amazement. "And son, not only living, but probably working." "Well, at least I am," Jessica said, which surprised the old cab driver. "If you need anything, just ask. I'll leave you my number just in case," the driver said and held out a folded notebook. "Thank you," Jessica replied, and then paid the fare. Fortunately, the driver helped her carry her heavy suitcases to the door of the house. "Don't let it go to waste," Brian shouted after the man coming in. Jessica smiled and was about to put the key in the keyhole when the door opened. Brian jumped in surprise and backed away. "Who lives there?" he asked. But Jessica couldn't answer his question. She didn't know who was hiding in the semi-darkness of the hallway, and how to understand it. "Or I'll call the police," she exclaimed, trying to make her voice sound threatening. She was answered only by a slightly audible old man's laughter, and then a weak male voice said, "Come on, honey. What kind of police are there when there is only one policeman for the whole neighborhood? If you call him, you'll be waiting till the evening, or maybe even until the next morning as luck would have it." "Who are you, Grandpa?" "A house elf." Brian beat his mom to the punch. The old man laughed. "Well, my friend, I'm not a housekeeper. I'm Roger, the former headmaster of the village school. And now I'm a retired man, living out my life in this house. Jessica turned pale. What about the inheritance? But it's my late Daddy Matthew's house. I've got the deeds to it and the keys, and it's all legal. Roger finally came out of the darkness of the house. He turned out to be a puny man in his 80s. Is Matthew dead? I don't know anything about that. Oh God, it's a shame about the heartbreaker. He was such a good man, kind, fair. Seeing that tears were streaming down the man's cheeks, Jessica cautiously asked, "Did you know my dad personally?" Roger shook his head sadly. Of course I did, and not only knew him. I was his father instead of his father. I taught him math at school, then algebra and geometry. The Matthew always had a clear head. God rest his soul. You must be his daughter. Jessica was visibly embarrassed. Yes, Roger. My name is Jessica, and this is my son Brian. The older man's face brightened. What a good boy. You can tell he's just like his grandfather. He's going to grow up smart. I know what I'm talking about. In the old days, I used to be able to recognize a student's abilities at a glance. Thank you. It's our pleasure, Jessica said discreetly, not wanting to tell her grandfather that Brian was her adopted son, not her own. It was a hot topic, and she didn't want to talk about it in front of someone she didn't know. Don't worry about it. I'll be out of the house tonight, so as not to disturb you and Brienne. Matthew let me stay here for a while. But I guess I've been here too long. It's time to do the honors, Roger added, and went to pack his things. For that moment, Jessica felt a sharp prick of conscience. It wasn't right to kick a man out of his house when he had nowhere else to go. Wait, Roger, don't go. Stay with us. If Dad wanted you to live here, then so be it. The older man looked at Jessica doubtfully. Oh, come on, you'll say that too. You and your family are going to live here, aren't you? Why do you need such a burden in the form of a decrepit old man? I've got one thing going on and one thing going on. And how's your husband going to take it? Why do you need an extra mouth? Although I do get pension, and not the smallest, by the way. So if anything I can help, I won't be a freeloader. Well, that's great. If you don't mind, you can stay for good. We don't know anyone in the village. You'll be a guide for us, Jessica summarized with a smile, tactfully avoiding the question about her spouse. Or what could she say? Still not divorced from her unfaithful husband, who on top of that was trying to grab her father's inheritance. No, Jessica had no legal issues. And why would she have any when everything was legal? Thank you, Penelope, kind soul sheltered, did not let go to die. My daughter-in-law threw me out of the house after the death of my son. Well, not immediately, of course, gradually. First she evicted me from my room to the living room, forced me to move, then to the summer kitchen. And then the road to vagrancy was open. What a disgrace, former headmaster. I was retired until my health failed, Roger lamented. Jessica frowned. How could an old man be kicked out of his house like that? Couldn't you go to the police? Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. Or the township council. Roger just waved his hand. Come on, Jessica. What's the point of wasting time on this? I've had a lot on my mind lately, and I don't blame my sister-in-law. God is her judge. Thanks for letting see her once in a while. She wanted to put me in a home for charity, but for old people like me. Anyway, I refused. I can't do without my kids. Every year on September 1st, I come and cry. I look at them and cry. Why are you crying, Grandpa? Do you have a pain? Or don't you like school? Brian asked. Roger smiled and brushed away the tears. It's because I'm happy, grandson, that the kids are going to school. When I see school uniforms, it makes my heart ache. They wanted to disband our school 5 years ago, saying it was too old, but I stood up for it. I even went to the region. I wrote a complaint and a petition. Thanks to the late Matthew, he helped me with transportation. He was a good man. Jessica looked at the older theme with respect, and then suggested that he go inside. To her great surprise, the inside was clean, not a speck of dust, no cobwebs or odor, and the kitchen was clean and scrubbed, just like before the inspection, Jessica thought, and such perfect order made her envious. Brian also liked the house, which seemed to him like the home of a good wizard from a fairy tale. As it turned out later, Roger had been hiding in a tiny room all this time, shy of occupying the whole house. What about work? Can you find anything suitable at all? Jessica asked. Well, it depends on what you need, what you're passionate about. I mean, you can go to the post office, or you can get a job on a farm as a milkmaid or a poultry farmer. If you're educated, go to school. Jessica was short of teachers. That's why the new principal keeps talking about disbanding the school, as if he didn't realize that not everyone in the family has transportation to get there. Roger said he did it. School. That works for me. True, I have never worked in my field. But did you spend all those years studying pedagogy for nothing? Jessica said with a smile. Wow. My mom's going to be a teacher, shrieked Brian. That's a big deal. I think you'd be very welcome at the local school, said Roger. Well, that remains to be seen. Maybe they won't hire me, or I might not be able to work. You never know. Roger smiled, and then began setting the table to feed his guests. He'd made some potatoes and cucumber and tomato salad before they arrived. Of course, it's not God knows what, but it's good for when your stomach is rumbling with hunger. Here you are, all your own from the garden. Even though it's small, it's still a breadwinner. I take care of the land, feed it in the fall with manure and humus. That's how I make a meal at one time, and I have food for the whole week. How much do I need there? A couple of potatoes, a cucumber. That's all we have to worry about in the country, said Roger. Oh, it's delicious, Grandpa Roger. It's delicious, Brian said with his mouth full. So the old man smiled. Eat. You need your strength. You're so thin. Your grandfather Matthew was just like that, though. Then he got stronger in high school and started working out on the bar. Jessica lowered her eyes again in embarrassment. No, she considered Brian her own son, period. There couldn't even be any talk about it. She'd taken the baby from an orphanage just under 7 years ago. The newborn Brian's mother had given him up for some reason, and Jessica had long dreamed of having a baby. In fact, the doctors gave her their verdict 3 years ago, when the examination revealed that she would not be able to have children. The decision to adopt little Brian Jessica had to make almost alone. After all, there was no hope for Eden's support. But the situation was further complicated by the fact that Brian had suffered nerve damage in his leg at birth, which could leave him with a limp for the rest of his life. But if you want him so badly, I won't mind. But why would you want a limp? Can't you get someone normal? Iden said with contempt in his voice. But aren't you ashamed to say that? He's still so young. Don't you have any compassion in your heart? Jessica said with tears in her eyes. I have compassion, but only for myself. Who's going to take care of me? That's right, no one. You, for example, are ready to take care of some defective boy instead of worrying about me, objected her husband. Of course, Jessica suspected at once that she would not find support in his spies, but to do such a thing was unthinkable. What are you, a child? Can't you take care of yourself? It's a child, you know, it needs help, maybe even corrective surgery, Jessica exclaimed. But if that's what you need, then go ahead. I've got other things to do, Eden said, and slammed the door. To Jessica's credit, she accomplished what she intended to do, which was to get custody of 3-month-old Brian. Subsequently, she showed the boy to one of the best specialists in the field of pediatric orthopedics and pediatric surgery, thanks to which the baby was able to finally get rid of his disease. Throughout this time, Jessica never told Brian that he was adopted. Why unnecessarily upset him, especially when Jessica loved him with all her heart and considered him her closest, dearest family member. The late Matthew Skorobogatov took his daughter's decision with restraint, but with understanding. He himself also dreamed of a grandson, and therefore was happy little Brian as his own. Hey, Papa, why did you leave an inheritance to that traitor? Where, pray tell, did your eyes look? Jessica thought sadly, after she had washed the dishes and cleared the table. She had no idea that her unfaithful husband Eden was thinking the same thing at that very moment. That was a good one. Did your father-in-law sign over the whole business to me, Eden? Asked his new mistress Olivia with a smile. The girl looked into his eyes with surprise. Yes, I can't say otherwise. And I'll be honest, how did you do it? Olivia asked. Eden smiled enigmatically. How did I do it? Simple. I shared it with the notary and intercepted Skorobogatov's will. He gave it to me himself. He was dying. He relied on me. I guess he saw me as his son. But I didn't hesitate. I made the most of my chance. I forged a signature on the will and got the notary to nail me. Olivia looked at him in surprise. But how did you do it, and why did the notary agree? I mean, it's illegal. Well, how I did it. It's simple. The notary's son had a traffic accident. Anyway, he was facing criminal punishment. The accident was high profile. The investigation found him guilty, and I managed to get a video of the license lie. What recorder? The girl didn't understand. Eden sighed unhappily. You're just like a little girl. A video recorder that takes pictures of the road. Yes, every second driver has one. And here I was lucky enough to find a witness to the accident. I bought the tape and presented it to a notary. And he agreed. Olivia wouldn't let it go. So where was he supposed to go? The tape was the main bargaining chip in the case against his son. He showed the tape in court. They dropped all the charges against the kid. But the real culprit of the accident got away. You can see it on the video. Eden looked at Olivia with a smile. She's a nice girl after all, slender. It makes my heart grow fonder, he thought. And what do you plan to do with your father-in-law's capital? Austin asked cautiously. I don't know yet. Most likely I'll sell the business for more money. And I'll put the money in a bank account to earn interest. You're a great strategist and thinker, Olivia said proudly. What did you think? Eden smiled. At that moment he felt like the master of his life. He'd done a good job of getting the rich man to come to the right place at the right time, and he had solved the problem of the will drastically, without unnecessary words and paperwork. Eden didn't even think about why his father-in-law trusted him on his deathbed. Was there really no other choice? Eden wrote it off as the effects of the painkillers, which the deceased could no longer do without, despite the fact that Jessica slept very poorly in her new place. After breakfast, she decided to visit the local school and talk about the job. Of course, she realized that it was summer, and she might not be enrolled on staff until September at best. But on the other hand, having a conversation on the subject clearly couldn't hurt. And she understood that as well as anyone. Ashley's headmaster was wary of her visit, as if expecting a catch. Why would this city fashionista want to infiltrate his staff? What if it was for testing purposes? They love that kind of thing. Oh, they do. And Ashley didn't want to lose his chair. He's the boss, and he's a big deal in this town. Everyone wants to say hello and bow to you when they meet you. The director looked at the documents and thought for a moment. On the one hand, he could easily refuse, because it was not a problem to find a reason. On the other hand, he was afraid he would make a possible enemy of her. No, I'd rather have her working under my supervision than spreading rumors back in town. And then they'll send an inspection, and then they'll find out that the funds for school repairs are being misused. Ashley thought and then said, addressing Jessica, "Well, I don't doubt your diploma and education. I think you'll fit in well with our team. And to help you get used to it, I suggest you work, so to speak, with the special contingent." "What special contingent?" Jessica was surprised. "We have a boy here, Scott. He's a sophomore. For failing grades, Scott lives with his wheelchair-bound dad. His leg's been missing since a car accident. Tractor driver was at fault. Now he's quit, so his dad's on his own. Of course, we help the whole village as much as we can." "What's that got to do with me?" Jessica didn't get the hint. Ashley grimaced. "I'd like you to give Scott a few extra lessons so that he'll be more prepared for the next school year." "Is that what you're saying?" "That would be fine." "I don't mind. We'll get started as soon as you say so," Jessica said with a sigh of relief. "But good. I don't think we should wait too long. Anyway, let's get started today. I'll let Scott's dad know. Why don't you wait in room 7? Okay, he'll be here in no time. He lives nearby." Jessica shrugged and, accepting the principal's suggestion, went out into the hallway. Fortunately, she didn't have to wait long. Soon, a panting schoolboy flew into the office, a folder with notebooks in his hands. "Hello, may I? Is this where the extra credit classes are held?" "Yes, Scott. Not for repeaters, but for underachievers. That's more appropriate. My name is Jessica Andreevna, and I'd like to start the lesson now." "Show us where we left off. Or rather, before we went on vacation," Jessica began in a pleasant, cheerful voice. Scott nodded in agreement and immediately showed the correct page in his textbook. As she watched the boy solve the problems and answer the questions, Jessica realized that he wasn't as stupid as the headmistress was trying to make him out to be. Not only that, but Scott's knowledge was about average, so he didn't deserve to be retained at all. So what's the point? Who is bothering this sweet and quiet boy? Determined to find out from Scott herself, Jessica cautiously began her questioning. At first he'd been withdrawn and refused to talk about it. But then, when Jessica began to talk about herself and her life, he became more open and animated. "My classmates laugh at me. They say my dad is a legless pirate, but he's not a pirate. Dad's a good guy, you know. He could have collided with a car, but he swerved and fell into a ditch with his tractor. He lost his legs. Well, I don't think your daddy's bad. On the contrary, if you don't mind, I can visit him after school. I have a son about your age. Right now, he's at home with Grandpa Eric. Is that okay?" asked Jessica as gently as possible. Jessica asked, "It's okay, but Daddy doesn't like visitors, but they'll probably let you guys in. He doesn't like the principal much. I fight a lot." "They come to my house," agreed the boy. "Why do you fight, Scott?" "It's bad. It doesn't do any good. It only gets you D's in behavior," the boy explained. "I'm protecting my daddy from people who make fun of him. He's a good carpenter. He makes different caskets so that you can't take your eyes off them. Well, that's interesting. A boy as smart as you can't have a bad daddy, Jessica said with a smile as she taught Scott a total of 4 lessons. She was pleasantly surprised by his knowledge. No, he's definitely not staying for a second year, but we'll work on his behavior, she thought on the way to Scott's house. As it turned out, the boy lived in a house on the very edge of the village. It didn't look much different from the one Jessica had lived in not so long ago. And when she saw the young man in a wheelchair, she was visibly embarrassed and slowed down. "What, son, did you mess up again?" Matthew, accustomed to such behavior, asked with concern in his voice. "No, Dad, it's Jessica, our new teacher. She's in town with her son," Scott exclaimed happily. "Oh, well, come in then. I've just boiled the kettle," the landlord said, changing from anger to mercy. Jessica smiled and accepted the offer. Truth be told, she hadn't expected Scott's father to be such a sweet and pleasant man to talk to. Matthew had been emphatically polite and hadn't tried to favor his son or denigrate the school authorities for keeping him in the second year. Sneaking a moment, the man said quietly, "My Scott's having a hard time. He gets insulted by everybody. It's understandable. I'm the reason they make fun of me for being legless. But it's only temporary. I'm saving up for prosthetics, the best kind, so I can feel human again." Jessica looked at Matthew sympathetically. "I understand. And I'll help Scott, and I'll talk to the principal." "It's not right. He's going to get whipped." Scott returned to the kitchen to continue the tea party. Unbeknownst to Jessica, Matthew was a very kind, good man. He didn't press for pity, didn't want to be sympathized with or made concessions. Not like Eden from Snowy, selfish, only thinking about himself, Jessica thought to herself. Matthew had already told her about his past life, when he had been a tractor driver, and was considered one of the most important people in the village. There's no place in the village without a tractor. "If snows in the winter, you'll never dig it out with a shovel," he said with a glint in his eyes. Jessica sat for a while longer and started to get ready to go home. At that moment, the cell phone in the young teacher's pocket vibrated, informing her that she had an incoming call. And when she saw the caller's name on the screen, Jessica cringed. It was Eden, and what does he want? Bet he really missed me and decided to call. Jessica thought and decided not to answer. What were they going to talk about? Pouring from empty to empty? The news about the inheritance? But it was clear enough. Eden beat her to it. Well, let him enjoy his moments of fame and fortune. It's his right. A winner's right. To Jessica's surprise, Eden was not satisfied with one call and repeated the call several more times. "Why don't you answer it? What if it's important?" Matthew natted. Jessica shook her head. "No, I don't want to. He's my ex-husband, even though we weren't divorced yet." So Matthew nodded sympathetically, then walked her to the gate, deftly shifting the wheels of the wheelchair with his hands. He tried to appear normal and not to focus on his illness. God, how unfair life can be. Why did he have to go through all this? Such a nice guy, Jessica thought. She waved goodbye to Matthew and Scott and walked down the street toward her house. From a distance, Jessica spotted a red foreign car that she'd obviously seen before. No, it couldn't be. But could it be again? As she got closer, she realized this car definitely belonged to Eden. Jessica was suddenly nervous. She didn't want to see her ex-husband. Even though they were still legally married, she heard Eden's distinctive voice, which she couldn't confuse with anyone else's. Her ex-husband was being defiant and shouting at an illegitimate son who had had the misfortune to go out into the yard. Roger tried to stand up for the boy, but of course he couldn't stand up to Eden. The businessman was furious, and Jessica realized it at once. As soon as she opened the gate, she was confronted by her ex-husband. "Ah, there you are, Jessica. Just what I need. I don't know who I've been asking." "What's this got to do with anything? Why did you come here?" Jessica exclaimed. Eden grinned. "You're still asking? Do you know that your father deceived me?" Jessica turned pale. "What do you mean, cheated?" What are you talking about? Are you out of your mind? It was you who got everything in the will, and I got nothing. Have you forgotten? No, dearie, I haven't forgotten. But your father was always up to tricks. He had it all worked out in advance, so that's why he emptied the company's accounts just before he left. And his business is on the verge of bankruptcy. What? Are you telling me you didn't know about this? Eden growled. Jessica's eyes showed genuine bewilderment. Of course not. Did you think otherwise? Eden shook his head sorrowfully. You're a liar, just like your father. You were all liars. They'd have to think of something like that. You've outplayed me wherever you can. Remember, I'm not going to let this go. If you don't return the money your father hid in secret accounts, you'll regret it, Eden said threateningly. Are you threatening me? What does this have to do with me? This is the first time I've ever heard this from you, Jessica said tearfully. But Eden was not convinced. On the contrary, he acted as if Jessica knew what her father was up to. After an effective pause, Eden said something that made her uncomfortable. If you don't find the money, you're on your own. You hear me? I'll make sure Brian's in an orphanage, and you'll be disenfranchised. Yeah, don't look at me like that. It'll be just like I said. At this point, Roger, who had been standing quite peacefully on the sidelines until then, intervened. I don't think you've chosen the right tactics. Young man, threatening a woman, and a young mother at that, is unthinkable. Eden's lips curled in a sneer. Who the hell is this grandfather? Is he a protector? He's a good one. He's only capable of grumbling. In fact, just look for the money. If you don't, Brian's going straight to an orphanage. I don't want to go to an orphanage. Dad, why are you doing this? And why are you hurting Mom? Brian exclaimed with resentment. I'm not your father. What are you talking about? Do we have anything in common? Eden left and headed for his car, where, as it turned out, his mistress Olivia was sitting. Jessica was so shocked by her ex-husband's confession that she couldn't say a word. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, and her hands were trembling as if after a nervous shock. What's the matter, Sharon? Don't take it personally. He's lying. I'm telling you, he wouldn't have the guts to do something like that. He's a small-time bastard. I've seen a few of those in my time. He's a threat, especially to women, Roger said in a low voice. Thank you for your support. It means a lot to me, Jessica whispered. But the older man just waved his hand. Oh, really? Thank you. What if that boar shows up again? Jessica calmed down a little and looked at the situation with different eyes. It seemed that her late father had bequeathed the loss-making business to Eden without any financial support. But then where had the money from his accounts gone? After all, Eden had inherited a bankrupt firm with a lot of debts and problems on top of that. Jessica, of course, had known her father was a good businessman before, so he'd always had the upper hand. But this was beyond her comprehension. Such a masterful combination. Matthew had done the impossible. Jessica, however, was neither hot nor cold about it. She had no idea where her father's money was really kept, and there were no people who could give her a definite answer. So how was your first day at work? Were you already at the table? Roger asked. Jessica smiled. I think so. I met Scott and his dad, Artem, the one who used to be a tractor driver. Roger's face brightened. I know him. A good guy. It's just a pity that life treated him so unfairly. He was, in fact, a victim of circumstances. If he hadn't turned the wheel, he wouldn't have saved the car and probably would have been less injured. Jessica sighed sadly. To tell the truth, she felt sorry for Artem, who had gotten into such a difficult situation. But what could she do? Nothing, really, except help Scott with his studies so that the boy could properly prepare for September 1st. The thought of Scott made her heart warm. A kind, intelligent boy. He's a joy to look at. The principal's good, too. Put him in the 2nd grade. No, that won't do, Jessica said. If Jessica only knew that the principal was thinking the same thing right now. Ashley had been working in the field for years, so he was afraid of anything that could even indirectly harm him. Most of all, he was afraid of any inspection that could lead him to a cottage in the suburbs, which was being built with some of the materials allocated for the school renovation. To tell the truth, Ashley was quite satisfied that in the near future the school would be disbanded, and he himself would be transferred to the district school. He didn't care how Scott, whose dad didn't have his own car, would get there. Eden, on the other hand, was in real trouble. The late Matthew had cleverly caught him on the hook when he asked his son-in-law to deliver the will to the notary. The experienced businessman immediately noticed a mysterious glint in his eyes and decided to take a big risk. As a consequence, Eden was faced with problems that he had never even suspected before. The creditors of the deceased demanded payment of debts, and competitors were ready to take the firm for nothing. So Eden found himself in a desperate situation in the true sense of the word. Now that he'd inherited the inheritance, all the strings were tied to him, and to play the situation back he could not, because he himself forged the will in the hope of appropriating the assets of the deceased businessman. But in reality, everything turned out quite differently. The accounts of the firm were completely empty, and all the employees of the company only helplessly waved their hands. That's when Eden realized that he had fallen into a real trap, one from which he could not get out alone. Naturally, he wasn't going to file for Jessica's termination of parental rights. So what would be the point, when she probably didn't know anything about the whereabouts of the money? 3 days passed, during which Jessica studied with Scott additionally and visited his father. With Jessica's arrival, Artem was noticeably more animated, his eyes lighting up with joy. He seemed to come out of his stupor, began to joke and smile. To Jessica's joy, the changes affected not only Artem, but also his son. Gradually, Scott turned from an insecure child into a confident boy, who was no longer afraid of circumstances and life's problems. Perhaps that's what the boy lacked, self-confidence and support. I believe you will succeed. And do not pay attention to your classmates. Soon they will envy you and consider you a leader. Just don't give up. Keep studying. And also please be restrained and don't rush to use your fists, Jessica said with feeling. I'll do my best during recess, Jessica Scott replied. And I don't know how long I'll be able to do it, but I'll keep at it, he said modestly. Seeing that the new teacher was not a threat to him, the headmaster relaxed. Now he was no longer afraid of the inspection and could continue to build his cottage in the suburbs overlooking the lake. Eden, fighting the avalanche of problems, left Jessica alone for a while, and she was glad. One day, coming home from work, she noticed a black SUV parked at the gate. Is Eden back again? Why is it in a different car? Where did the money for such purchase come from? Did he sell his father's firm for nothing? Jessica thought. But when the young teacher came closer, a gray-haired man in his 50s with the appearance of an office clerk came out to meet her. Jessica, the stranger asked. Yes, it's me. What's up? The man smiled and immediately switched to an informal tone of conversation. I am your late father Matthew's attorney. The fact is that he has instructed me to hand over to you personally the details of the accounts where the money is kept. The accounts are completely transparent and the tax authorities will have no problem with them. The money is intended for you personally and has nothing to do with your husband. Jessica corrected in a muffled voice. Yes, the X. I don't mind the wording. I also have an envelope to give you. I don't know what it contains, but it was given to me by your father shortly before he died. And it was Matthew who set the date for you and I to meet. Not a day sooner, not a day later, the office clerk summarized. Felix took the packet of business documents with bank account details with a trembling hand. Jessica placed the envelope in the side pocket of her blouse to open a little later. To having accomplished his mission, the man politely said goodbye and got into the car. Jessica, on woozy legs, walked over to the bench, leaning on one side, and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from Daddy, which began with the following words. My dear daughter, if you are reading these lines, it means that I am no longer alive. So I apologize in advance for this whole show with the will, but I could not do otherwise. I had to set the record straight to expose your husband Eden. With my will in his hands, I'm 99% sure he'll try to fake it and turn the situation in his favor. Fortunately, I've taken care of that, and Eden is out of the woods. I put him in charge of an unprofitable business that will only bring trouble and the realization of the mistake he made in betraying you. I'm leaving you with savings most people can't even dream of. Spend it wisely for the benefit of yourself and your grandson, Brian. Your Papa Matthew. Sitting on the bench, Jessica reread what she had written over and over again. My God, is it really true? She thought. Tears ran down her cheeks when she found a picture at the bottom of the envelope. A picture of herself as a child, wearing a light daisy dress and barefoot sandals. Why are you crying? Did something happen? Did your father hurt you again? The son came up from behind and asked anxiously. Jessica turned around and a sweet smile played on her lips. Oh no, Brian, really? It's okay. It's just that we won't be poor anymore and we'll be able to do anything we want to succeed. Wow. Can we build a store here? You know, like in the city. And a playground and a water park for sure. The boy exclaimed happily. Of course we can. We just have to wait a little longer, Jessica replied. From that day on, their lives really changed. First of all, Jessica sent some of the money for the renovation of the village school, which upset the headmaster. Thanks to Jessica's intervention, all the machinations of Ashley, who thought only about his own profit, were revealed. After learning that the school would get a second chance, Roger could not hold back his tears, hugging Jessica. The elderly man cried and thanked fate for bringing him together with the daughter of the late Matthew. Jessica didn't forget about Jack, who had received an invitation to one of the best prosthetic centers. Jessica, thank you so much. I don't even know how to thank you, the man said with barely contained excitement. She smiled and looked at Scott looking out the window. Well, who was right? That's right, me. And no one else, Jessica said, as Scott smiled back and ran outside to hug his favorite teacher. Tears sprang from Jessica's eyes as the little boy expressed his gratitude. Since Ashley had been fired right after his shenanigans had been exposed, it was only natural to wonder who would be the new principal. And that's where the villagers were in unanimous agreement, Jessica, no one else. No, what do you mean? I don't have any experience. I've only just joined the staff, Jessica whispered embarrassedly. Roger was more than persistent. Go for it, Jessica, don't be stubborn. There's no better director. You were just made for this job. People trust you. You have allocated so much money for personal repairs. Jessica smiled embarrassed and then thanked everyone for their trust. Wow, my mom's the principal now, Brian squealed happily. As Jessica cut him off, don't get too excited, buddy. I'm not going to let you off the hook. Don't count on it. I'm going to ask you for your material just like everybody else. Learning is light, you know, and unlearning is darkness. Scott said with a smile. Jessica turned around and at the same moment saw Artem in front of her, holding his son's hand. He was standing, and not just standing, but able to move, leaning on a stick as he walked. Jessica almost lost her senses in astonishment. Could Jack have recovered so quickly? The whole thing seemed unreal. About 3 months after these events, Jessica and Jack were married. It was quite modest by local standards, but the newlyweds didn't need more than that, and the most important thing was that they were able to find each other. They lived in a memorable village, where such miracles were rare. The only thing they knew about Eden was that he had finally gone bankrupt and lost everything he had stolen from his late father-in-law. As it happened, it was Jessica who paid off the company's debts and bought the controlling interest at auction for next to nothing. By that time, they were already divorced, and Eden received nothing from this deal. Left penniless, he went under pretty quickly, selling his car and most of his personal belongings along with his jewelry. Kayla's stepmother also got exactly nothing good after the departure of her spouse. All to blame was the lover, who cleaned the stroppy beauty to the thread. But in the village, school made such a good repair that now the occupancy of classes with students has become prohibitive. After all, they were going to them students from all the surrounding villages. Jessica even had to run her own school bus on the route. Roger was extremely happy about it because he had worked in this school most of his life. Looking at the children rushing to school with their backpacks, he thanked Jessica and Jack for giving the village a second life.
Emily was raised by her father, Joseph. She did not remember her mother and did not know what happened to her. Her father didn't like to talk about it and always left her in different ways. As time went on, Emily grew older. Here, just to get away from questions about her mother was no longer possible. On one of the next days, the 16-year-old girl rolled the most real scandal. "Why don't you tell me what happened to Mom? Is she alive or not? Why do you avoid this topic every time? How many times can you do this?" Emily paced from side to side, trying to calm herself down, but it was having no effect. Her father looked at her sympathetically, realizing that keeping quiet on the subject had become too hot in their small family. "Why are you silent again? Where's my mother? Why didn't you ever tell me where she is? Maybe I want to visit her. I want to tell her what's going on in my life, even if she never hears me." Emily had long ago concluded that something had happened to her mom, and that was why her father was keeping her tragic fate quiet. Perhaps it really would have been better that way. However, there was not a shred of truth in the girl's speculation. Sighing heavily, Joseph walked over to his daughter and put his hand on her shoulder. He looked carefully into the girl's eyes, trying to calm her resentment a little. But it was to no avail. "Who the hell are you to withhold information about my mother? And the one that carried me under her heart, that gave me this life? You have no right to withhold that information from me. Who is she? Where is she? Tell me something about her." Emily screamed with helplessness, with the pain and resentment that had been lurking in her soul for so long. Tears streamed down her cheeks, which she stubbornly ignored. Joseph's heart clenched unpleasantly as the picture unfolded, and he exhaled convulsively, and gathering all his will into a fist, he muttered, "Your mother just didn't want you. We found out late enough in the pregnancy that there was nothing we could do. She didn't want to have you, didn't want to become a mother, thought she was too young for it, and convinced me too that you didn't fit into our future. But even before you were born, I felt that you needed me, that you were the ray of hope for a bright future that I was not ready to give up. She could never love you, and right after you were born, she wrote a rejection letter. I begged her to think about it. I begged her to stay and be with you for a while. I assured her that she would love you, but your mother was adamant. She didn't want to spend time raising a child. She didn't want to wake up at night. She didn't want to change diapers. She didn't want to lose her beauty through constant sleep deprivation and stress. And she walked away, leaving you so tiny and defenseless alone in the hospital." His voice shook, and he stopped, deciding it wasn't worth continuing the story any further. Emily stared at her father in silence, trying to comprehend what she had just heard and make sense of her feelings. The only thing in Emily's girl's eyes was the question why, but that's not what she asked her father. "And you didn't even try to find her, didn't try to show her what I've become independent and not requiring so much attention and care. Maybe she could have loved me, wanted to come back and start a family. Why didn't you try to make sure I had a mom like any other normal kid?" Emily switched to shouting again, not holding back her resentment and negative emotions. She looked at her father with incomprehension, trying to understand why he was so calm, why he was not worried, telling about how he just gave up the chance to build a normal family. The man looked attentively at his daughter, giving her a chance to spill everything that had accumulated. Then, calmly answered, "I tried. Gave her time to think about the decision and called only a few days after you were at home. But she didn't pick up that day, the next day, or the week after. She couldn't do that to me. She wouldn't leave me. She gave birth to me, carried me under her heart. Why doesn't she love me? Why do all mothers love their children, but mine abandoned me? Joseph gently pulled his daughter close, trying to calm her. Tears were already streaming down Emily's cheeks. Sobs echoed every second. He felt he had started this conversation early. But would there be a good time when the story of a child abandoned by her mother wouldn't resonate with pain? I don't know, honey, I really don't. The only thing I do know is that I would never leave you. I would never hurt you like that. Would never let anyone take you away. The man fell silent, wondering whether to continue the story or drop the subject. After a few minutes of tense silence, he decided to continue so as not to return to the painful subject. I tried to tell her what a beautiful little princess you are. I sent her pictures of you, wrote messages, letters to her parents, but all in vain. After a couple years, she blocked me, changed her number. Her parents moved. I lost all contact and didn't know how to tell her about my growing angel. He stopped talking. Emily's shoulders shook with sobs. That was all he wanted to say, what she should have known about her birth mother. For several minutes, father and daughter stood in silence. Joseph was giving Emily time to realize the bitter truth. Gradually, she calmed down, her breathing evened out, but the trembling in her body remained. The girl looked into her father's eyes. But since it happened, since she gave up on us, why didn't you just set up a life with another woman? A lot of people do that. I wouldn't have known she wasn't my mother. How could I lie to you like that my whole life? If I told you that the woman you thought was your mother wasn't, wouldn't you look for your mother? Wouldn't you want to know why you have a stepmother? Would you forgive me? After this? Emily was silent. She had never before thought about how her father would have lived if he had had another woman. Would he have been happy with her, or would he have continued to blame himself for Emily's motherlessness? Would he have been able to never tell her that she was being raised by her stepmother? Or would she have found out when the time came anyway? The girl looked at her father carefully. There was no sadness in his eyes, no longing or any other feelings that expressed bitterness at the choice she had once made in favor of her own child. She gently put her arms around the man and spoke almost in a whisper. If you are happy, I will be happy. If you want to build a relationship, you want to be happy and loved, then I will be happy if in your life there will be a worthy woman who will be by your side both in sorrow and in joy. You have the right to do as you see fit. Emily smiled. Joseph couldn't see it, but he could feel it. He could hear it in the timbre of her voice, in the way she snuggled gently against him, and the breathy way she spoke of what she was thinking. The man had never considered that model of a future with someone other than his daughter. She had always occupied all his thoughts, all his feelings. He couldn't imagine bringing a strange woman into the house and telling his daughter to call her mom. But now Emily had grown up, matured, and realized that there must be room for love in everyone's life. Maybe she was right. Perhaps he really should think about finding a worthy woman with whom he could meet his old age. But had he known how such a wish would end, he would have thought several more times before making life unbearable not only for himself, but also for a completely innocent man whom his daughter simply could not accept. No matter how hard he tried to make it happen. Time passed. Emily had already forgotten about that conversation with her father, after which the man seriously thought about his lonely future. After the departure of his daughter to study, despite his inner resistance, he still decided to give himself the opportunity to be happy and began to actively search for a woman with whom he could get closer, so as not to meet old age alone. A couple more months passed. Emily continued to go to school, studying hard but acceptably. In the absence of constant supervision, the girl felt free and completely left to herself, and therefore did not worry about bad grades, failed tests, and scandals with teachers. But only until her father was called to the school. One weekday evening, Joseph's phone rang. The man picked up the phone, and then after a second he looked at his daughter with some displeasure and contempt in his gaze. The girl immediately understood everything and wanted to leave, but suddenly her father gestured for her to return to her seat. Emily exhaled convulsively and sank back into the chair, squeezing her head into her shoulders, and already realizing what was going to happen. "Yes, thank you, I understand," Joseph said into the phone. "I'll try to come in tomorrow at lunchtime and talk to the history teacher about my daughter's progress. Thank you for calling. Have a good day." The last words sounded like a sentence, and Emily knew that under the circumstances she couldn't avoid a serious conversation with her father. She looked at him carefully, hoping he would cool down and not lecture her. But he wouldn't. The man moved closer and started talking. "Do you realize that no one will need you without an education? What do you plan to do with your life? Work as a janitor or maybe a cleaner? Or do you want to find a rich husband who will provide for you and not put you in anything? You will live like a bird in a golden cage, where you will constantly close your mouth and point to your place. Is that the future you want for yourself or what you're trying to achieve? Emily lowered her eyes to the floor. She didn't like these conversations with her father and didn't expect teachers or the principal to decide to contact her father to discuss her grades at all. The silence was becoming oppressive. She had to say something to avoid looking completely stupid. I just don't see the point of this story. Why would I want to know what happened before I was born and what I can't influence? It's just unnecessary information that will never be useful to me. Or do you think we're going to have uprisings or presidents being overthrown again? We're in a completely different time. And all this history I'm learning has nothing to do with our lives. I don't need it. Joseph looked at his daughter carefully. For such a young age, the reasoning seemed serious but also childish. You should learn history, at least so that I don't get called to school on my work days, and so that I don't have to blush, because you don't think a history teacher is an important teacher. But that's my opinion. You've always taught me to stand up for it, to always stand my ground, to always fight back. And now you're saying it's wrong. What do you expect me to do if you can't decide how I should behave? And now you're telling me I have 7 Fridays in a week. Emily jabbed her finger and rose quickly from her seat to avoid further conversation. However, her father held her hand. My dear, you must understand the difference between standing up for your rights and violating the rights of others. Your rights end exactly where another person's rights begin, and you cannot violate them. The man let go of his daughter's hand, and the daughter, after staring at the gas station for a few seconds, abruptly turned around and went to her room. Joseph sighed heavily, anticipating not the most pleasant conversation with the teacher the next day, and not yet realizing that fate was preparing for him such a welcome and long-awaited gift. Barely free at lunchtime, Joseph hurriedly headed to school. Realizing that he didn't have much free time to spend talking to the teacher, it was easy to find the classroom. However, before he could even enter it, the man froze. Sitting at the teacher's desk was a young and attractive woman who looked completely lost in a classroom full of humming. It took a few seconds until Joseph was able to pull himself together and get out of his strange stupor, confidently entering the classroom and speaking menacingly. Everyone calmed down immediately. Who taught you to behave like this in front of adults? Or some of you want to replace the teacher and tell a new topic on your own for a grade? Let's also call the principal to see how smart the students in this school are. The class was instantly completely silent. Not even the rustling of textbook pages or any of the other rustles that are so common in classrooms could be heard. The woman gratefully looked up at her savior, trying to figure out where she could see him. Good afternoon. I was asked to come in to talk to you about my daughter Emily's 8th grade performance, and she's been a little off her game lately. And yesterday the principal pointed out that she's been especially bad in history class. So I thought I'd come here to talk to you in person. The man smiled bewilderedly, realizing that his appearance was a lifeline for the teacher, and therefore there was hope in his soul that she would somehow change her mind about his daughter. But how could she not? The woman nodded slowly, looking around the class and giving the assignment they were to complete while she spoke to the student's father. The classroom continued to be completely silent even after the adults stepped out into the hallway, which was a great indicator of how Joseph's words had affected the overall atmosphere in the classroom. Do you understand? Your daughter Emily, she does not consider my subject important at all, and therefore she does not learn anything, does not want to answer in class, does not do her homework. I tried to explain to her that it is necessary to study the material at least in order to successfully graduate from school and enter the direction that will be interesting to her in the future. But these words had no effect on your girl, the teacher began. And already at this moment Joseph realized that the conversation would not be very pleasant. She behaves terribly in class, constantly distracts other students, and sometimes even does everything possible to disrupt the class. I reprimanded her, called the principal to the lessons, used disciplinary measures. However, there was no result. Therefore, I had no choice but to call you to the school for an educational conversation. You must influence your child, otherwise she will not finish school with a good average grade, and this will have a negative impact on her future. I hope you realize that this is serious. Joseph took a deep breath. He had certainly expected nothing good to be said about his daughter during this meeting. but he couldn't even imagine it being this bad. He looked at the teacher carefully and tried to squeeze out at least a semblance of a smile. "I'll do everything I can to influence her," he said. "But you know it's not as easy as it may seem. I'm always at work, doing everything I can to make a decent living for her, so I don't have enough time to raise her." The teacher blushed visibly, whether from the man's words about doing his best and her judging him, or from the strange feeling that was growing stronger in her soul by the minute, making her anxious and breathless. The silence became tense, and the woman made an effort to break it. "Forgive me for an inappropriate question, and why the girl's mother does not participate in her upbringing. Does she also work all the time? Or maybe you have younger children, and she simply does not have time for an adult child, who in this case is left to himself. Just at this age, a girl needs a lot of attention from her mother. Practice shows that it is mothers who have the greatest influence on the unformed psyche of the child. So you talk to your spouse or invite her to school so that I can talk to her. Maybe it will give better results." Joseph's eyes showed a faint pain that hadn't left him in years. He'd always tried to be the best father he could be, investing all his energy and money in his daughter, giving her all his free time. But apparently it was not enough. He could not bring her up to be a decent person, instill a love of education and respect for elders. He could not replace her mother. The man raised his eyes to the teacher, who watched his reaction confusedly. And as hard as it was to admit, he dared to say the words that had been running through his mind for so long. "We have no mother and no one to replace her. Perhaps it was because of me, because of my desire to become a father, because I did not support my beloved in her decision to give up the child. Perhaps I am to blame for the fact that Emily has become so spoiled I can't give her enough time to be around her all the time, to help her with her lessons and personal problems. Perhaps if she had a mother, if I had made more of an effort to find and keep her. If Joseph had been a little more persistent and confident back then, his little daughter Emily would have been a very different person. Perhaps there is some truth in what is happening now and in the words of others. Maybe he's just a bad father who couldn't handle raising his own child. That's all there is to it." Joseph faked a smile, trying to look confident and convincing, pretending that he wasn't hurt by his own words, that he had long ago come to terms with what had happened and knew he was failing as a parent. He stood still, looking at the drawings on the floor in the hallway, and suddenly felt the touch of a warm woman's hand. "I'm sorry, I had no idea you had such a situation in your family," the woman said. "I am sure that you are a wonderful father and you are doing everything you can to make your daughter happy." The teacher looked at the man warmly, trying to convey her sympathy. "I didn't mean to hurt you or hurt you. Emily never said she didn't have a mom, or I wouldn't have brought it up. I'll try to be more sympathetic to her, and given the circumstances, I'll talk to the other teachers. We understand how hard it is for a girl to go through a difficult adolescence, albeit with the support of such a wonderful father." The woman raised her eyes to Joseph, who was looking at her with sincere gratitude. There was so much appreciation and warmth in his gaze that it made her uncomfortable, and she wanted to pull her hand away, but he intercepted it, pressing it to his chest. "Thank you so much. I am very grateful that you are willing to understand our situation and help my daughter with her studies. It's very valuable to us, and I'm sure Emily will do her best to improve her grades as well." "Well, thank you. But you can just call me Mary," the teacher said. "Thank you very much, Mary. You're a wonderful woman. I hope you have a good life. I have to go to work, or I'll be late after my lunch break, and that's not welcome in this company." "Yes, of course. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk to me about your daughter." Joseph turned to leave, but Mary called out to him. "Excuse me, but why don't I come over and talk to you about Emily's studies and grades? Perhaps my words will have some effect on her, and she will decide to get smart. It's not hard for me, if that's what you need." Joseph smiled warmly, nodded, and said gratefully, "I would really appreciate it if you would talk to my daughter, and I confess I would enjoy spending some more time with you. You're a very pleasant woman. We look forward to seeing you tonight then. I think Emily will be glad to have this kind of participation from her teachers." Joseph walked briskly toward the exit. Mary felt her face flush. She had a strange, frightening, yet pleasant feeling for Joseph, and she wouldn't mind spending a little more time with him herself. Emily took the news that her teacher was coming to talk to her about her grades very badly. "I don't need strangers giving me advice on how to live my life," she resented her father as she watched her father prepare for the history teacher's arrival. The man wanted to make the best impression, so he even left work early to clean up the house and prepare something for dinner. He didn't seem to mind his daughter's outrage at all. Joseph was absorbed in his own thoughts. "Do you even hear me?" Emily almost shouted. "I do not want her to come to our house and tell us how to live properly, how to behave, and how to treat her. I don't need her guidance and advice. I can fix my own grades in school, Dad." Joseph perked up, realizing how deeply he had thought about their recent acquaintance. He seemed to have found the one person he was ready to spend his life with, someone who made him feel at ease, who truly understood and supported him. But is it appropriate to date his own daughter's teacher? Does she have a husband or a young man? And most importantly, how will Emily react to the news that her father has fallen in love with the teacher, whom the girl, it turns out, sincerely hates? A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. It was Mary. As promised, the woman looked just fine, not at all reminiscent of the teacher the man had seen during the day at school. Her makeup, beautiful dress, and confident gait made her different from the hunted mouse he'd encountered. But that only added a fire to his gaze and made his new acquaintance even more attractive and alluring. "Good evening, Mary. You're looking very well. It's good to see you." "Good evening. It's nice to see you again, Joseph." Emily looked out of the living room, wondering what was going on in the other room, and since when her father had become so polite and courteous to women. But when the woman saw the girl looking intently in their direction, she immediately returned the businesslike tone and serious look she always used at school. "I hope Emily knows what I'm here for, and that she and I are going to have a serious conversation. You warned her about this, didn't you?" "Of course I did. Emily's waiting for you in the living room. She knows what you've come for." Mary, as if ignoring the confusion on the man's face, went into the room where Emily was waiting for her. The girl was sitting on the sofa, making it clear that she was not happy about the situation and had no plans to talk to her teacher. Mary looked at her carefully and said, "Hi, Emily. Your father, Joseph, is a little worried about your performance in school. I know you're a smart girl, but lately your grades have been slipping. Why don't we talk about what's going on? Look, studying is an important part of life. It helps you decide your future career, develops your thinking skills and self-discipline. I want to help you, but to do that, I need to understand what's wrong. Maybe you find it difficult to learn the material or lack motivation. We'll figure it out together. Emily, you're an amazing girl with a lot of potential. I can see you trying, but something is keeping you from performing at your best. Let's find a solution that will help you learn the program and get you back on track. I will be there for you and will do my best to support you. Joseph is worried because he's worried about your future. He wants you to have lots of opportunities and prospects after school. But this is your life, and you will choose your own path. Our job is to help you go after your goals with ease and confidence." Emily looked at Mary, her teacher. She could see irritation in her eyes. Nevertheless, she decided to answer. "Mary, you are very nice trying to support me. But I know exactly what you're talking about. My studies, my future, my goals, they're all important. However, at the moment, I just don't have the desire to make the effort. Maybe that will change later, but right now I'm not interested in cramming textbooks and writing tests. So unless you have any more new information or advice, we have nothing to talk about." Emily said it in a haughty tone, as if challenging her teacher. Joseph, who was in the next room, was upset at his daughter's behavior. Joseph was worried about Emily and wanted her future to be secure. He wanted Emily to grow up to be a decent, independent person, able to stand up for herself, provide for herself, and not need anything. His admonitions are attempts to help guide her on the right path. "I don't need your advice. I know how to live my own life," Emily said. "Stop telling me how to behave, what decisions to make, who to talk to. I'm an independent adult who can make decisions that affect my future. Stop telling me what to do." Emily, look, no one is prying into your life. We're trying to help you, to keep you from making serious mistakes that could negatively affect her. You see, we're not telling you what to do or how to do it. We're telling you, guiding you, helping you figure out how to do better. Mary put her soul into every word, trying to be tactful and pleasant, so that Emily understood the essence and stopped resisting, began to learn. But the result was the opposite. Emily looked at the teacher unhappily and spoke haughtily. "Tell those who need your advice about how to live better. I don't need them at all, and I'm sure that I can organize my life without your interference. Thank you for coming, but I don't intend to talk to you anymore. My friends are waiting for me. Have a good day." Without waiting for a reply, Emily stood up and headed for the exit. The door slammed. Joseph jumped up and walked quickly into the living room, expecting that it was his daughter's teacher who had left, not her. Looking confused at the obviously upset Mary, he sat down next to her and spoke quietly. "She's always been temperamental and explosive, and this has nothing to do with you. She's hard to please. She does things her own way. Do not take her behavior to heart. It has nothing to do with you." Joseph noticed the warmth and appreciation in Mary's eyes and, looking away, continued. "Thank you for trying to talk to her. It may not have been successful, but I'm sure she appreciated your attempt to help. But the important thing is that I at least tried to help you," Mary admitted suddenly, smiling softly. Joseph quickly looked at her in surprise. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to try to influence your daughter. I'm sure she and I can still find common ground. She's not what she wants to be. She is very vulnerable inside and hides it behind a mask of detachment." Joseph smiled at Mary and gently touched her hand. "I am very grateful that you were able to make time for my child. I understand that you have a lot of things to do and worry about. This is very important to me, and I must admit I was very glad when you came to visit us. I made dinner, by the way. It's not a work of art, of course, but I'd be delighted if you'd stay and try it." Mary agreed. The couple felt the attraction, but in a way they tried to hide it, to suppress the strange feelings growing inside, preventing them from thinking straight. But no matter how people fight fate, they still find themselves subject to feelings and desires. Joseph and Mary are no exception. The relationship between them spiraled rapidly. After a couple of weeks, Mary began to visit her new suitor more often and even stay overnight on weekends. Emily immediately noticed the change in her father's behavior. And at first she was even happy for him, but only until she found out with whom her father was building a relationship, and she wasn't going to accept his choice. "What's this all about?" Emily grudgingly asked her father during breakfast. "What is she doing in our house? Why is she even here?" Joseph looked at his daughter with incomprehension and spoke calmly. "You yourself wanted me to find a woman with whom I would spend my free time and with whom I would like to meet old age. And I found one. I began to control you less, give a lot of time to myself and my interests, and you became a fully independent person who makes his own decisions, without the constant nagging from me. What's wrong? Why aren't you happy with the choices I've made?" "Because it's not a choice," she said. "You just decided to start a relationship with my teacher so that she would do me favors at school. You decided that this way you could help me improve my grades. Well, I don't need that kind of help from you. Just know that. And you better stop this before it goes too far. Otherwise, you will regret it later, and it will be too late to change anything." The girl said grudgingly, watching her father's facial expressions carefully. "And what makes you think that I decided to start a relationship with Mary for the sake of your studies?" Joseph asked. "How so?" "It's plain and simple. I was having trouble with this particular subject. I refused to accept help from her the last time she came to our house, and you thought you could improve my grades just like that if you started a relationship with it." She waved her hand toward the bedroom. She waved her hand toward the bedroom where the woman remained, unable to find a decent word. "You decided to start a relationship with her to improve my grades, but I don't need that kind of sacrifice. Thank you very much. So, Daddy, you can dump her and live peacefully to yourself without this connection." Joseph listened attentively to his daughter, realizing that she really believed everything that was said and did not accept the possibility that he could just fall in love with his own daughter's teacher. Several tense minutes passed until he decided to tell Emily the truth. "Sweetheart, this has nothing to do with you," he said softly. "I realized that you didn't want control and that you were going to make all your own decisions. I realized that last time, so I left you alone. Gave you the freedom to take charge of your own life and make the decisions that would affect it in one way or another. I'm honestly not even sure I was doing the right thing before, trying to control you all the time. And now you have the opportunity to really make all the decisions yourself, to make the choices that will affect your life, without being constantly controlled by me or your history teacher." The man hesitated, trying to find the right words. "What about Mary? I love her very much indeed. and I want to build a happy relationship with her. They have nothing to do with you. No one's making any sacrifices to get you good grades and a happy future. I just realized at one point that I really liked this woman, and apparently she feels the same way about me." Joseph smiled dreamily, already imagining a happy future with his chosen one, not paying attention to his daughter's unhappy grimace. Suddenly, Emily slammed her fist on the table, looking at her father with displeasure and saying through her teeth, "When I told you that I'd be happy if you found the woman you'd like to grow old with, I didn't mean that you should fall in love with my teacher, who would make my life at school simply unbearable." "You can't just start a relationship with her like that," Emily said grudgingly. "Everyone would know about it. What would happen then? What would they say about you?" Joseph shrugged his shoulders, expressing complete incomprehension of his daughter's displeasure. "What will they say about me? We're all adults and we understand that people fall in love," he replied. "I've spent my life raising you, giving you everything you could ever dream of. And now I want to feel happy and loved. I want to be with a woman who really loves me. I want to grow old with her. I want to spend every day at work, knowing that I will be waiting for me at home with a hot dinner. You see, I have the right to be happy too, no matter how old I am." Emily's gaze grew heavy. She looked at her dreamy father with obvious displeasure as she listened to his wishes and dreams. Emily looked at Joseph with obvious displeasure as she listened to his wishes and dreams. She hadn't expected him to find a woman so quickly. Emily had thought that he would have his personal life already after she left to study, and he was alone. Did he lack love and care from his daughter? Had he been unhappy spending time with her before? Was everything he said really true? But then why did it hurt so much inside? Why did every word he said make her so uncomfortable? Emily slowly leaned toward her father, leaving about 10 centimeters between their faces, and gritted through her teeth. "I'm sorry that you weren't happy because of me, and couldn't build the life you dreamed of because you had to take care of your daughter. Perhaps it would have been better if you had just given up on me. I would have gone to people who loved me instead of thinking of me as a burden." Emily abruptly pulled away from her father and headed for the exit. On the way, she bumped into her history teacher, Mrs. Mary. The woman smiled. "Good morning, Emily. I hope you remember that there's a history test tomorrow. Prepare well to pass it the first time." Mary wanted to touch the girl, but she took a step to the side, not allowing her to touch. Emily looked at the teacher with hatred. "I used to dislike only your subject, but now I sincerely hate you too. I hope you are happy with ruining my life." The girl quickly walked out, ignoring the teacher's incomprehensible look and her father's heavy sigh from the kitchen. She was so hurt, lonely and sad. She didn't think her own father would trade her for a woman he didn't know, be happy with her over his daughter, and choose her in the end. Tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving wet paths, everything squeezed inside. There seemed to be almost no air left in her lungs. The world was fading and becoming unreal. She walked on, not caring what road she traveled, just to get away from the house, not to see her father's happy face, and the one that had taken him away from his daughter. Emily didn't know how much time had passed, but when she came to, it was already dark. Looking around, the girl realized she was in an unfamiliar neighborhood. The fear inside made everything tighten. There was no one around to ask for directions. The phone was left at home. There was no money for a cab either. What to do? Where to go? After thinking for a while, Emily decided to walk in the opposite direction, hoping that on the way she would remember where she had come from. Emily felt herself getting more confused with each new turn. Tears rolled down her cheeks again, but now from helplessness and powerlessness. She didn't know where to go, she didn't know where she was or what would happen to her, and most importantly, whether anyone was even looking for her, or whether her father was only glad that such a burden as she was finally gone from his life. Inside, everything was shrinking from fear and not understanding what would happen next. It became scary to turn somewhere, to go in an unknown direction. There were sounds around, from which the girl shuddered every time. Complete darkness began to press on the psyche. The heart beat faster. It seemed that it was pounding so hard that it could break the chest. Suddenly, the girl heard some voices behind her back and turned around to see who had come outside to ask for help. There was a group of guys standing in the distance, talking loudly about something. They didn't see Emily, and so she decided to approach them herself to find out where she was and where she should go to get to the right street. But the decision made in fear and panic was not the best one, and Emily soon realized it. But it was too late. Approaching the company of guys, the girl felt a strange anxiety, which was different from the fear she had before. It seemed that getting too close was not the best decision. However, the guys had already noticed her and were watching carefully as the frightened and completely lost girl slowly approached them. A grin appeared on the face of one of the guys, which obviously didn't bode well. But Emily still dared to ask. "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to Lincoln Street?" Emily stopped a few meters away, asking her question loud enough to be heard clearly in the company of the guys. Even so, no one was in a hurry to answer. One of the guys took a step closer to the girl, followed by a second and a third. They stopped just a couple dozen centimeters away from her. One examined Emily closely, and his smile only grew wider. Leaning over to her, he muttered, "What's a little girl like that doing alone? Baby time is long over at night outside, and you should be in your little crib." All the guys started laughing with glee, which made everything inside the girl feel as if she had fallen. She felt fear and excitement, realizing that it would not be possible to get rid of the attention so easily. But the main thing was to know where to go and not to provoke the guys. There were strange lights in the eyes of some of the strangers that only made Emily more nervous. It took a few dozen seconds before she was able to squeeze out a few words. "I was just taking a walk and got lost. And now I don't know how to get home." She had hoped that such a childish confession would make the boys realize that she was just a child with nothing to take from them. But it seemed that this manner of speaking only served to irritate the boys. One of them came very close to the girl and touched her shoulder. "How nice we are," he said. "You can't tell from the looks of us. You know, I especially like girls who are obedient, who will do whatever you tell them to do and don't ask questions. You're like that, aren't you?" The boy looked into Emily's eyes, and she could see the evil lights dancing in his gaze. She wanted to run, but it was too soon. And where would she go if she didn't know how to get home? And running, not knowing where to go, wasn't the best solution. She'd be exhausted too quickly, and this group of guys would easily catch up with her. So we have to somehow turn the situation around so that they tell her where to go, and only then start running. "I'm sorry, but I just want to go home. My dad's waiting for me there. He must be very worried about me," Emily said in a shaky voice. Emily walked down the unfamiliar street. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. "Excuse me, can you tell me where to go? This is my first time here." Two guys approached her closely. One of them ran his fingertips through her hair. Emily felt an uncomfortable sensation but stayed where she was, trying not to provoke them. "If you behave and do everything we say, we'll walk you home ourselves afterwards so no one else can touch you," the other guy smirked. "But only if you're good, and if you get cranky." He lowered his voice deliberately, giving it an ominous tone. Emily realized she couldn't expect any help from these guys. She thought feverishly about what she should do. She couldn't think of a single sensible way to hide or get away from a group of tough guys who clearly looked stronger and tougher than she was. Her heart was pounding faster and faster, blood pounding in her temples. "So, will you behave yourself?" The other guy asked again, continuing to stroke her hair. "Or do you want to play naughty girl and get punished?" He leaned very close to her ear. "Hey, stop messing with her," shouted irritably the third guy in the crowd. "Let's get out of here. How long can we stand here? We're attracting too much attention." He moved toward Emily with determination. Realizing that there might not be another chance, she ran down the street, not looking back and trying to ignore her racing heart. A second's hesitation from the boys gave her a small head start, but soon she heard them catching up to her quickly. Emily realized what would happen if they caught her. She ran as hard as she could, feeling her legs jacking up. Turning corners, winding streets, her eyes were already swimming in multicolored circles from lack of air. The realization came that there was no escape. And then Emily bumped into someone on the sidewalk. She lost consciousness, but felt someone's strong arms pick her up. The next thing she knew, it was darkness, no thought, no feeling. When Emily regained consciousness, there was light all around. She was lying on a pillow, her body aching unpleasantly, reminding her of her recent adventures. Her throat was dry. Her eyes ached from the tears shed last night. Looking around, the girl realized she was in a hospital room and tried to raise herself, but she felt dizzy and weak. Slowly lowering herself back onto the bed, she decided to wait for someone to come and explain the situation. Suddenly, Emily noticed a rustle to her left and was startled to see the boy sleeping peacefully in the chair. Her insides clenched with fear. Had she been caught after all? Had they done something to her? And now someone from that company was sitting next to her so that she wouldn't say anything unnecessary? Tears came to her eyes, and the girl decided to leave the room and find a doctor on her own. But when she tried to get out of bed, the guy woke up. He looked carefully at Emily and, smiling slightly in a sleepy voice, said, "I'm glad you've come to your senses." The doctors said that Emily had just had a lot of exhaustion and excitement happen to her. But the guy was still worried that those bullies might have done something to her. The doctors didn't want to leave him, but since Emily's cell phone was dead and she had fallen into his arms, he was allowed to stay and monitor her condition until her parents arrived, who were due to arrive soon. In the meantime, he would guard her sleep as best he could. The guy smiled again, and that smile somehow made him feel much calmer. "So you're not one of those guys who chased me so hard?" Emily asked tiredly, slowly lowering herself back onto the bed and closing her eyes. "I was already scared that you were with them and sitting next to me to keep me from saying too much or convincing me that everything was my wish." Emily exhaled convulsively, trying to catch her breath. "Don't worry, it's okay," Joseph replied. "They've all been detained until the circumstances are clarified. They tried to prove to me that they hadn't touched you, but I didn't believe them. Now let them think about their behavior behind bars, at least until you testify." The boy moved a little closer to Emily, peering gently into her tired and frightened eyes. "Didn't your parents teach you that it was dangerous to walk alone on dark streets at this hour? What if I hadn't been around the corner? What if they'd caught up with you before you could get to me? Do you even think about the consequences of your decisions?" Emily felt herself blush thickly. She didn't want to be lectured by a complete stranger. But there was truth in his words, and she decided to tell him everything that had happened that night so that she wouldn't seem frivolous. The boy listened to her attentively, and then, with a sigh, spoke. "Yes, I understand you perfectly well. I myself had such things misunderstanding from parents, quarrels, and scandals. But you know, once my history teacher gave me a really good advice that changed my life. You know what she said? That no matter what emotions reign in my soul, no matter how much I want to leave, to stop communicating with my parents and get rid of their overly intrusive care, they are still my parents, who gave me life and sacrificed a lot to provide for me, to bring me up and give me a chance for a normal life. That's why I should treat them with respect, tolerate their quirks, just as they once tolerated my childish whims and tears. Of course, I couldn't fully accept their behavior and forget their mistakes. But I think that advice did help me to be easier on them, to make concessions and to forgive some things." Emily lowered her eyes to the floor. Another piece of advice, another admonition, another attempt to pry into her life that she was so sick of. She sighed heavily, looked at the guy carefully, and mouthed, "Thank you so much for saving me tonight. But I'll figure out how to live my life on my own. I don't need your advice and guidance. I'm sorry. I'd like to learn from my mistakes. Okay?" "No, you've got it all wrong," he smiled. "I was just sharing my life experience with you. I didn't want to teach you how to live or change your views and attitudes. I just told you how I see the situation, that's all." He went back into his thoughts. "I just realized I should have been closer to my mother. It was too late. At a time when I had no way to get close to her, or just have a heart-to-heart talk with her. Some mistakes teach valuable lessons, but the toll they take on our lives is too high." A few seconds later, there was a rustle in the hallway, and Emily's worried father came running into the room. He seemed to have aged considerably in just one night, and even changed in his face. The girl watched with incomprehension and some sympathy as his gaze frantically traveled over her, and then stopped on the boy who had remained close by. Joseph rushed to embrace his daughter, pulling her gently against him. Tears were rolling down the man's cheeks, and it looked so unusual that the girl was finally confused and froze in indecision, not understanding what to do and how to behave. She gently pulled away from her father, looking into his eyes and asking in all seriousness, "What's the matter with you? I've come home late before and stayed overnight at a friend's house without permission. And you've never been so worried?" "I always knew where you were and what was wrong with you." The man's voice trembled, and that made her feel even more uncomfortable. "And this time it seemed to me that something terrible had happened, that you would never come home." She was not used to seeing her father in such a state, not used to seeing him weak and depressed, and so everything inside clenched unpleasantly at the unfolding picture. She turned to the boy, who was watching father and daughter closely, and sighed. "Admittedly, I did get myself into a bit of a mess. But thanks to this young man, Emily pointed to the boy beside her bed. It's all over, and I'm safe and sound now. I'm lucky I met him on the street, or I'm afraid to imagine what might have happened. She was silent, realizing that it was better for her father not to know the whole story, especially given the state he was in. Joseph immediately turned to the stranger and began to hug him. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking care of my daughter. She's such an impulsive but good girl. She's very lucky to have such a compassionate young man. I'm afraid to even imagine what could have happened if she had met one of those criminals that frequent the streets at night. There has been so much bad news already. The boy noticed the pain flashing in Joseph's eyes, and turning back to Emily, he noticed the pleading in her eyes. And it all became clear. He made the decision to keep quiet about everything that had happened as well. To calm the man down and not to complicate the life of the rescued girl, gently pulling away from the man's strong embrace, the guy adjusted his clothes and spoke in a calm voice. I think that's what anyone in my place would do. Leaving such a beautiful girl in trouble is not gentlemanly, so I couldn't do anything else. Besides, I didn't do anything wrong. I just brought her to the hospital after she passed out in the street. Noticing the anxiety, if not horror, in Joseph's eyes, the guy immediately hurried to continue. But the doctors said she was just exhausted, and that's the only reason she passed out. She's completely fine. They'll take some tests in a couple of hours, and if everything is fine, they'll let her go home. He smiled, trying to make his words positive and convincing. But there was still anxiety in Joseph's gaze. He looked at his watch and then at his daughter and spoke. I have to report to work now. I have a promotion coming up that will pay for my princess's education and I can't miss it. But as soon as you get all your tests done and are told you can go home, I'll come right over to pick you up. Okay, sweetie? Or, if you want, I can ask Mary to meet you. No, Emily answered firmly, not even wanting to hear her father's suggestion. I'll get home on my own, and I'm not going to let your Mary meet me. I don't need her help. She's the reason I left home. She's the reason everything happened. And you don't understand that, and you stubbornly don't see it. She said resentfully, folding her arms across her chest and turning away from her father, clearly showing that she didn't want to continue the conversation. Joseph sighed heavily, trying to understand how to please his daughter and keep his own happiness. At that moment, the stranger spoke. I'm on the car. Today I have the day off so I can take your daughter home myself after the doctors say that she is fine. Then you won't have to take off work and risk a promotion, and your beautiful daughter won't have to make concessions to be met by someone else. The guy smiled, waiting for an answer. Of course, if you don't mind. Joseph looked at Emily carefully. Even in this situation, she was still cold and distant, and it bothered him a lot. After a few minutes, the man made his decision. Fine, but if she doesn't want to go with you, just call me and I'll call a cab or come myself. It was nice to meet you. Joseph fell silent, realizing he didn't recognize the name of his daughter's savior. Brian. It's nice to meet you too. I hope this isn't the last time we see each other. It's nice to see such loving fathers. The boy smiled, extended his hand, and Joseph shook it in return, then walked briskly out of the room. I can get home on my own. I don't need your help, she said almost in a whisper, despite Brian's presence. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. The boy moved closer. At that moment, Emily felt her heart beat faster. I'm telling you, I'm capable of getting home on my own, she said louder, deliberately moving away from her savior. I don't need anyone's help or handouts. Thank you. But it seemed like you couldn't have gotten home on your own last night. Plus, your cell phone is still dead, and the hospital doesn't have a charger. How were you going to get home? The guy reacted unhappily. And you don't have money for a cab. Emily realized that she was in a desperate situation and would have to ask her nighttime savior for help anyway. Okay, she muttered. There was a pause for a few minutes in which everyone was thinking about something else until the girl made up her mind. Thank you for saving me. I'm afraid to imagine how things would have ended that night if you hadn't been there. Probably nothing good. You're welcome, the boy replied simply and sincerely, looking into the eyes of the saved girl. I couldn't leave such a beautiful girl alone. It was good that I went outside at that very time. It was like something was beckoning me to stand there. Fate, I guess. The girl was embarrassed by what she heard and hurried to look away, so as not to see the guy's smile, which gave her a wave of goosebumps inside. Brian, on the other hand, watched the girl's reaction carefully, trying not to miss anything and admiring the one that saw his soul. Emily was indeed discharged home. The tests were normal. However, the girl was advised not to overexert herself. She was released from classes for the next few days and recommended to undergo a full examination to find out the cause of fainting. As promised, Brian drove the girl home. Emily took her time getting out of his car, scrutinizing the guy. After a few minutes of silence, he asked, "Do you want me to walk you straight to the door, or can you walk yourself?" "I can do it myself," she replied. "Thank you for coming to my rescue and driving me home, despite my unbearable temper. And thank you for just being there for me the whole time. It was very important to me." Emily slowly leaned over to the guy and kissed him gently on the cheek. The warm touch of her lips sent shivers down Brian's body, and at that moment he realized that next to him was not just an accidentally rescued girl, but the one given to him by fate. The guy took Emily's number, and from that moment the couple's communication spiraled rapidly. After a couple of months, Brian offered the girl to meet, and she agreed. The relationships with him became a kind of outlet, which helped to distract from the constant reflections on his father and his new passport. Toward the end of the school year, Joseph decided to make Mary a proposal, so that in the summer to play a modest wedding and legalize their relationship. And that was the last straw in Emily's patience. She did not intend to watch her father build a life with the one she hated so much. And so the girl made a sharp, in her opinion, the only right decision to move out, and to tell her father about it she decided to immediately. "What are you leaving after the 9th grade?" Joseph said with displeasure, pacing from corner to corner in the living room and trying to calm down, so as not to say too much to his daughter. "What about higher education? What about the prospects you've been striving for all these years? Are you really just ready to give up everything because of another whim?" And at that moment Mary came to him, who gently took his hand and looked into his eyes and gently said, "Let her make her own decision. She is an adult and can be responsible for her actions. We all learn from our mistakes. Maybe this will be a great lesson for her on how not to act in a situation, or maybe she will actually get what she wants out of life." Joseph exhaled convulsively. He wasn't ready to make that kind of decision from his daughter, and so the idea that it might be the right one seemed somehow unrealistic. Still, he decided to listen to his chosen one and closed his eyes and spoke. "Maybe you're right, and Emily really just needs more freedom. I just wanted to say that her decision seems wrong to me, and that I think it will lead to a completely different outcome than she expects. That's all. I didn't forbid her from making her own decision, nor did I say that she should give up her aspirations to please me. I'm just trying to keep her safe." "I understand, darling," Mary said softly, looking into Joseph's eyes. "But she's a big girl, and she can decide for herself how to be, how to behave, how to act in any given situation. She's not a little child, after all." The man sank down in his chair. He realized that it was really true, that it was time to give his daughter the opportunity to make her own decisions and dispose of her life as she saw fit. But the anxiety and worry wouldn't let him go. He looked up at his daughter, and only at that moment did he notice the unkind grin on her face. And in the next second, Emily spoke with displeasure and anger. Of course, who'd have doubted she'd say that? I've always been a bone in her throat. And now that she's had a chance to get rid of me early, she's not going to miss it. Still, I made the right decision when I realized it was time to move out. Otherwise, I would have had to endure 2 more years of a disgruntled look on my face and some stupid accusations against me. Emily forgot to put her shirt back on, or didn't wash her plate, or behaved inappropriately in front of guests. She thought that then a calm and measured life would come. As soon as I get kicked out of my own house, right resentment and dissatisfaction with the situation could be heard in Emily's voice. It was clear that the girl was not thrilled with the decision, but thought it was the right one. Confused by his daughter's words, Joseph muttered, "What does Mary have to do with it, if you yourself decided to move out after 9th grade? It's your decision, no one imposed it. Why, when Mary supported it, do you think she wants to evict you? I don't understand anything." Joseph looked at his daughter carefully, hoping she would realize the error of her ways. But Emily became even more disgruntled. "Of course you never see what's wrong," she glanced obliquely at Mary, who looked incomprehensively back and forth at her future husband and Emily, not knowing whether to intervene or remain silent. Joseph rose slowly and approached his daughter. Placing his hands on her shoulders, he looked into her eyes. "Sweetheart, why do you always have some strange competition with the woman I truly love? She hasn't replaced you for me. She hasn't become the only one I love. She has no prejudice against you. Contrary to your speculation, she's trying to connect with you, to get closer, and you're pushing her away. She's not replacing your mother, and she never intended to. But can't you have a warm relationship for my sake?" The man looked at his daughter with hope and tenderness, but her gaze became hard and displeased. "You knew from the beginning that I didn't approve of your association with my teacher. What made you think I would be thrilled to marry her? It's your decision, not mine. I don't have to support it. I'm sure she's only with you because of the house and work. Not the love you're talking about. You can see it in her." Mary sighed heavily, realizing that building a good relationship with Emily would be difficult, but she had no idea how much. Joseph replied calmly, "You're right, it's my choice and it's not your place to judge it. It's not like I'm judging your Brian and I'm trying to build a good relationship with him, because he didn't interfere with our family, try to take me away from you, or tell me how to live my life. Since you're so happy with her, you should know that you lost me because you chose her." Her Emily shouted to her father through gritted teeth. She raised her head proudly and went to her room, hoping that the conversation would influence her father's decision to marry Mary. But it didn't, and the girl decided to move away from her father as soon as she received her diploma. Emily entered college in another city and from the first days lived with Brian. He rented an apartment, paid for groceries and expenses. While the girl was studying, Brian loved her unconsciously and was willing to do anything to make her happy and stay close to her. Despite her father's protests that it was too early for Emily to live with a boyfriend, she did her own way, as always. Joseph soon reconciled, taking Brian's promise that his daughter Emily would definitely get an education and only after that become a happy mom and wife. And boy did he promise that he would. Mary and Joseph played a wedding, to which Emily decided not to come. She did not want to be present at that celebration, which she absolutely did not approve of. But Brian was not in favor of such a decision. "Why don't you want to be there for your father on such an important day?" he said. "I think he'd like it if you could come, especially since the wedding is in the summer, before school starts, which is very convenient for you. They made sure you could get to their celebration without missing school." The guy watched with incomprehension as the girl tore the wedding invitations into small pieces, sitting on the living room floor. "I won't go where I'm not welcome," Emily replied. "And I wouldn't be welcome there, believe me." "But why do you think that? They sent you an invitation, and they took the time and effort to make it and sign it. They even invited you to come early to help organize the party. This is one of the most important days of your father's life." That's right, in his life, he made the decision to marry that witch. Despite the fact that I hate her, despite our terrible relationship, despite the fact that she treated me abominably and told me how to live my life, what to do, what to wear, despite the fact that I am an adult, an independent person. And she is the reason that our relationship with my father, which he spent so long building and cherishing, has shattered. I don't want to see him choose her over me. I don't want to see him give up our good relationship for someone who only values a spacious house and a big wallet. Emily closed her eyes and sighed heavily, trying to calm down and get her thoughts in order. She didn't want to think any more about the fact that her father had chosen some other woman over her, that he had made her the center of his life, and that he had made the decision to marry in spite of her displeasure. But Brian kept asking questions, trying to figure out exactly what had happened and why Emily had this attitude toward her future stepmother. "But she didn't do anything bad to you, right? She just fell in love." "She didn't fall in love," Emily cut her off. "She came into someone else's family and made her own rules that I had to follow. And my father, like a blind sheep, didn't want to see her leading him around and making him a tosser." "Well, maybe he was just really in love with her," Brian suggested. "He wanted to do everything he could to make her happy." "I love you very much too, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure that you don't need anything and can live the life you want. I always fulfill your requests." Emily looked at him unhappily. She didn't want to continue this conversation, and she certainly didn't want to waste her time explaining to him the problem and the reasons for his bad attitude. "Just trust me. She's not at all who she says she is," the girl said. "She's a disgusting, mercenary woman who will do anything to keep my father on a leash and bounce around on her hind legs. I know exactly what she's trying to accomplish. And she got it in the end. I tried to save him from this mistake. I tried to show him that he became just a slave who does not know anything and cannot distinguish lies from the truth. But he didn't listen to me. He made the choice she whispered to him. Let him suffer now. Brian was silent, realizing that the conversation would not lead to any expected result, and therefore there was no point in continuing it. Emily had almost completely stopped communicating with her father. She rarely returned his calls, hardly ever read his messages, and stopped coming home completely. She still considered him a traitor, didn't want to accept his decisions, and couldn't let go of the resentment that sat in her soul. Emily finished her studies and started working in her profession. 6 months later, Brian proposed to her. She accepted. It was decided to just sign, not to make a lavish wedding, and just spend the day for themselves. That's how it all worked out. They began to live together, to build their family life, and therefore there was no time to worry about her father and his new wife. Emily was completely immersed in her life, not yet realizing what a surprise awaits her from fate. One weekend, Emily's phone rang. She looked at the screen and saw Mary's name. Goosebumps ran down her body. Her stepmother was calling her, and she was the last person she expected to call. The girl blocked the screen, not wanting to pick up the phone, realizing that she wouldn't hear anything good. Suddenly, Brian's voice sounded. "Who's calling you on your day off? Is it work again? Is there a problem?" "No, my stepmother has decided to ruin my life by showing up again," Emily answered. "It's been so long, and she can't stand the fact that I don't want to be around their family. I'm sick of it." "Well, maybe something's wrong. She's not just calling. Pick up the phone, at least to see what they want you to do." The guy looked out from behind the corner, looking carefully at the girl, who stood near the phone with a disgruntled expression. "You just won't blame yourself," he continued. "Then, if something's really wrong, and she's not just calling, you'll pick up the phone. Come on." Emily looked down at the phone, the ringing stopped, and she exhaled shakily. But at the same moment, the call came again. There was a strange excitement inside that defied description. After hesitating for a few seconds, she decided to pick up the receiver. "Hello," she asked grudgingly, expecting to hear anything but what Mary would say in the next few seconds. "Joseph. He didn't survive our automobile accident. The funeral will be on Monday. Will you be able to make it, or won't you be expected?" Emily slowly slid to the floor. She expected to hear anything but that. Several minutes of complete silence passed before Brian looked out of the kitchen and was immediately stunned. His wife's face was as pale as a sheet, her eyes full of terror. He slowly approached her, looking into her eyes and asking with a tremor in his voice, "What's the matter? What did your stepmother say to you? What happened?" He crouched down beside her, trying somehow to figure out from the girl's look what had happened. "Daddy's gone" was the only thing the girl could whisper, and tears came to her eyes. She dropped her head to her knees, trying to suppress her sobs. Fear, pain, misunderstanding, and other negative feelings raged inside. Panic was rising more and more. It was getting harder to breathe with each passing second. Breaths were being taken. Circles appeared in my eyes. The funeral had gone smoothly. Emily didn't remember exactly what had happened, and the only moment she remembered was Mary, who was now confined to a wheelchair forever. It had been several months since the tragedy. Emily still hadn't fully recovered. She couldn't accept that her father was gone, that she would never be able to hold him again, to hear his voice. But as they say, trouble does not come alone. Emily's health took a serious hit. She was constantly visiting doctors, and sometimes even lay in hospitals for constant checkups. She lost a lot of weight, almost ceased to be happy about simple things, did not leave the house, and often cried. She literally wore herself out, not giving her body the slightest opportunity to recover from the tragedy. And she herself understood it perfectly well, but did not want to change anything. As time went on, the situation only got worse and worse. Emily thought it couldn't get any worse. After Emily's father died, her stepmother Mary said she needed her stepdaughter's help. She explained, "The doctor said I need constant care. I find it difficult to do simple household chores on my own, even cooking a meal. I don't have money for a caregiver. I understand that we had a bad relationship. You never loved me and didn't want your father to associate life with me. But since we've become related, we should help each other through a difficult situation." Brian expected Emily to react negatively, however, she just nodded silently. She later told her husband, "I don't care. I'm just going to hire a caregiver for her. I hate her. I don't want to see or hear from her unnecessarily. I don't want to take care of the woman who ruined my father. She's not my family. I'll never be nice to her. I'd rather give my last dime to a caregiver. But I won't live in the same house with her. I don't care." Mary heard Emily's words but didn't object, realizing her stepdaughter wouldn't change her mind. It pained Brian to see his mother-in-law in need of help. He noticed that Mary looked at him carefully, and she thought his face looked familiar. As promised, Emily hired Mary a caregiver for her care and household chores. It wasn't cheap, so Emily took on extra work, staying late, doing what she could to pay the caregiver and have money for herself. This strain was taking a toll on Emily's health. She was losing her attractiveness and her health. Brian's entreaties to take on less work didn't work. Emily refused to help, seeing it as her area of responsibility. Over time, Emily's health deteriorated greatly. She constantly went to doctors, took tests, but no one could understand the cause. Doctors said that she was exhausting herself, not giving rest, and nervous tension leads to exhaustion. Brian looked at the doctor hopefully. "Isn't there anything that can be done? She's literally withering away, so young, and she has no vitality at all. She looks exhausted and tired. Isn't there anything we can do to help her? Are we just going to leave her like this?" The doctor was silent for a while, then replied sadly, "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. She is exhausting herself, and until she stops doing that, her condition will not improve. So you need to talk to your wife on your own. Explain to her how important this is, that she has to live for you, for your happy future. There's nothing I can do until your wife wants to live. Do you understand me?" Brian walked out of the doctor's office depressed. He realized that nothing was going to work because Emily wouldn't listen to him. He had tried talking to her, urging her to eat better, sleep better, work less. But all these talks had no effect. He realized that his entreaties were useless, and there was no way out. Brian was not going to give up, so he decided to make one more attempt. "Honey, how about we go on vacation? There'll be lots of good food. We'll vacation together and spend some quality time together. We should do that, don't you think? I have to work. I can't go anywhere yet. I can't just take days off. I can't let my bosses down. If I don't, I won't get my bonus. And if I don't get the extra money, what's the point of my job? If I don't bring anything to our family?" Brian looked carefully into the girl's eyes and saw so much pain and despair in them that he felt uncomfortable. He took the girl's hands in his own, gently moved closer to her, and gazed into her eyes. "Please, Emily, for my sake. Let's take a vacation, relax, spend time together, and taste so many delicious things. It's been so long since we've been alone together, without work and worries and cares. Let's just be together. I'll pay for the caregiver, all your mother's expenses. Let's just be together." Emily looked at her husband with tired eyes. She didn't want to decide anything, didn't want to take part in any of these fights, didn't want anything from this life. The silence was becoming tense, and Brian realized that his wife's answer was obvious, but he hoped she would agree to spend some time with him. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to pass my responsibilities on to you. I promised my stepmother that I would provide her with a caregiver, and that responsibility is mine. You don't have to take over. We'll definitely spend time together when I get a promotion, or when I don't need a nurse. It just takes a little time." "Okay," Brian replied, realizing that his wife wasn't going to change her mind or agree to drop everything to spend time with him. But Brian and Emily were not destined to spend a single vacation together as husband and wife. One night the girl became very ill. The ambulance came quickly, but the doctors could not help in any way. Severely exhausted body almost did not fight for life. And a few days later, Brian received a call from the intensive care unit with sad news. Funeral arrangements were made quickly. Emily had never said where or how she wanted to be buried, but Brian was certain that she should be next to her father, that this was the place she rightfully belonged. He handled the arrangements entirely on his own, not allowing anyone to interfere with his advice and guidance. He knew how best to do things and understood perfectly well how things should be. He had buried a loved one before. But at the time of the last funeral, the last time he had seen his mother's lifeless face, he had thought he would never be hurt like that again. But Brian was wrong. This time the pain seemed dozens, if not hundreds of times worse. He wanted to scream, to cry, to be hysterical, but he held on with all his might. He knew that his tears wouldn't help, and probably would only hurt Emily's loved ones more. That day had left an indelible mark on his heart that he would never get rid of, that would always be with him, and that he would have to accept and learn to live with. He could not imagine that he had so little time to enjoy life with the one he loved. After the funeral, the tears flowed. He could not calm down, he could not pull himself together. So after the funeral was over, after breakfast, he came to his sick mother-in-law's bedroom to do what he had long dreamed of. He fell into her lap, shaking with sobs that he could no longer hide. Pain, resentment, longing, and frustration all blended into one emotion that would not let him go. He didn't want to live, didn't want to do anything else in this life. He felt like he was all alone again, a lost and unwanted boy who wandered the empty streets at night. "I remembered you at my husband's funeral," Mary said. "You looked at me like that." "No, but I didn't remember that look until later. You were the lost boy who needed support and advice. You're the Brian who couldn't recover from losing his mother and who didn't even want to live. You've grown so mature, so strong and beautiful. I knew you would become a beautiful man, but strong people need care and support sometimes too. Need someone to say a few affectionate words, to comfort them in misfortune and help them cope with the most intense sadness. It takes someone to support them, learn to stay by their side and sincerely believe that everything will be fine. And if you have no one else, if you yourself no longer believe that something else good is in store for you in the future, then I will do it in your place." Mary gently ran her hand through the man's hair, inviting him to share her sorrow and trying to convey in such a simple gesture all the love and care she felt in her soul. She wanted to share it with someone who really needed it. "Why me again? Why am I alone again? Why does fate have such sad plans for me? Why can't I just be happy? Can't help but lose the people I care about more than myself. Why can't I? I just can't be happy like all the people around me. And why things don't work out the way I want and desire. Why?" Brian continued to lie on his mother-in-law's lap. Tears flowed silently down his cheeks. It seemed that he had already accepted the inevitability of his fate, that he no longer resisted it at all, and that he was ready to accept everything that was happening to him. But Mary was sure that it was not yet over. "You know, for every major trial, fate sends you a gift, something you've wanted or needed for a long time," she said. "She doesn't just send you trials, she tests you for resilience to thank you afterwards for all your suffering, for your perseverance and persistence, and for the fact that you don't just give up and go to the end. Now you will always have me. I will be there for you. I will support you in any situation, always help you with advice and deeds if you need it. I will help you to get out of this abyss, as I once helped you to cope with the darkness that surrounded you so quickly. I won't leave you alone. I'm not going to let you just give up. Just remember that you are not alone." The woman gently pressed the man to herself, trying to convey all her warmth and confidence that tomorrow would be better than today, and that in the near future everything would be much better than now. The next morning, all the neighbors were shocked that Brian had fired his mother-in-law's caregiver and started taking care of her on his own. He realized that he could not and did not want to stay alone, and that the best solution would be to spend his life with the person who would really help in a difficult moment, who would be there for him, who would support and help with advice, and who would not betray and would not leave in a difficult situation. Brian didn't just start doing all the household chores on his own. He also worked hard on his mother-in-law's health. He wanted to make sure that her life was safe and that she would be able to live many more happy years, even if she was confined to a wheelchair. In the meantime, the doctors were giving a good prognosis, and that made the guy feel much calmer. He was able to calm down a little and began to try to live on. Now, not only without his mother, with whom he once parted not on the most pleasant note, but also without his favorite woman, for whose sake he was ready for a lot, but could not do anything to convince her to live on. Perhaps there was a reward ahead of him for such a serious ordeal, but maybe it was just an experience that he will just have to accept and move on with his life.
Jennifer pressed the brake pedal smoothly. There was a sharp turn ahead of her, and right before the exit to the bridge, such a dangerous moment, she had to be careful. That's why she decided to slow down. Jennifer was not a very experienced driver in Los Angeles and preferred not to take any unnecessary risks, all the more so in just a month she was going to be married. and her fiancé had given her a car. Not a new one, of course. Use, she said when he mentioned it. But why? I mean, if money's a problem, I could do without a car for now. It's not that, Kirill replied softly. I just don't see the point of buying a new one when a used one, still in good condition, can be bought much cheaper. Besides, I'm sorry, but you just got your license. Anything could happen. You'll feel sorry for a new car. Not so sorry about this one, he said. Are you saying I'm inexperienced? Jennifer was insulted. No, of course not, laughed the groom. It's just that I remember when I was a beginner myself. You'll get the hang of it, and if you want, we'll both buy you a new car. Yes, perhaps you're right. She really did not resent Kirill at all. After all, his arguments made sense. Besides, he had always been very thrifty and adhered to the philosophy of prudent economy, including due to this Jennifer had chosen him out of several possible suitors. So what was there to complain about? Besides, although the groom said that there were no problems with money, she realized that it was not quite so. To be more precise, he had money, but only to spend them on expensive purchases was not too reasonable. For several years, Kirill had been successfully developing his own business, which still required considerable investments, including financial ones. Of course, in some ways he had it easier than the others. He got the money to start the business from his parents, who were already long-established businessmen. In addition, they could give him valuable advice, but that was the end of their participation in the affairs of their favorite son. From childhood, he was taught to be independent. She was from a simpler, though not poor family. Her parents worked as middle managers, received quite good money, and had no ambitions for their own business. Her daughter followed in their footsteps. She managed to work in several firms and a little advance in her career before she met Cyril. Already during their relationship, her fiancé offered her a place in his company. And not just any position. She was to be his partner. But no, she firmly refused. I have too little experience for such a responsible position. As I have not that much, Kirill objected. I learn everything literally on the fly. Well, you still have some knowledge from your parents and the experience of running your own business. I'm just not ready for that. Okay, well then how about this? You come to me in the same position you're in now, and at the same time we will tighten your knowledge and skills so that you can become a full partner, said Kirill. After all, if something happens to me, who but my wife? I will leave the management of the business. I don't say that, Jennifer, who was prone to some superstitiousness, said indignantly. She was on her way home from work now. Her fiancé, as usual, was still in the office. He had a lot more to do than she did. That was the main reason Jennifer had gone to get her driver's license in the first place. And after that, she got her own car. Getting from the city office to their country cottage without a car was not very convenient. Suddenly, Jennifer realized something was wrong. She should have turned right, but no matter how hard she turned the steering wheel, the car kept going straight ahead. Later, the bridge railings showed up, looking too flimsy. It was clear that they would not support the weight of the car if she drove into them, even at a low speed. Jennifer went into a state of panic. She didn't understand what was happening and pressed the brake pedal as hard as she could in desperation, but it was too late. The car rammed the railing and flew straight into the river. As if in slow motion, it began to sink under the water. Whether from the collision or from too much stress, or maybe all of them together, Jennifer lost consciousness. A traffic jam began to form on the shore. Passersby stopped and got out of their cars. Gradually, a crowd gathered on the bridge, and all these people watched helplessly as the tragedy unfolded. Everyone wanted to help, but no one knew how. We should probably call an ambulance, someone said. No ambulance, he objected. We need an ambulance. The paramedics won't dive into icy water to pull her out. By the time the intercom gets here, she'll be drowned. Call at least someone. After all, shouted others, you're so smart. The crowd quarreled, argued, and could not come to a consensus. Someone did call the rescue team or the doctors. However, it was clear to everyone they would not get there in time. Precious time was lost. The bright red car was sinking deeper and deeper under the water, taking the woman behind the wheel with it. The count was no longer minutes, but seconds. No one in the crowd realized where this guy had come from. Obviously a vagrant, his appearance in dirty, tattered clothes certainly did not come by car. Before people realized what was going on, this new character threw off his old jacket and, without thinking for a second, dived into the cold water. When the mysterious stranger swam to the car, he too was completely engulfed by the turbulent river. And then the man dived in. The crowd seemed to hold its breath and watched along with him. The noise ceased instantly, and an ominous silence hung over the bridge. A minute passed, a second, a third, and then, at last, the brave man's head appeared above the water. And not only him making powerful rows, he was obviously dragging something heavy behind him. The tension in the crowd was building. It seemed to have begun to rise with a new force. No one realized if Jennifer was alive, or if the drifter had only succeeded in making the rescue service's job easier by pulling her body out. Meanwhile, the hero himself, paying no attention to anyone, reached the shore and, putting the hapless driver on the ground, began to perform resuscitative actions. After a few seconds, Jennifer coughed, began to spit up water, and opened her eyes. She could only stare at her savior in surprise and gratitude, unable to utter a single word. But the crowd, which later managed to move from the bridge closer to the new place of events, exploded with applause and jubilant shouts. The ambulance that everyone had been waiting for arrived, and no one noticed how the mysterious man disappeared, not even bothering to take his dilapidated and probably the only jacket. Jennifer was taken to the hospital. A couple hours later, her fiancé arrived there as well. At her request, the doctors notified him of what had happened. But of course, he did not know any details and was terribly worried all the way, not imagining in what condition he will see his beloved. In addition, Kyle blamed himself for what had happened. He was well aware that the most likely cause of the accident was a car malfunction, which he had overlooked when buying the car, all because of his idiotic desire to save money. Would not have taken for his beloved a new car straight from the showroom with a warranty, or at least not stingy on a normal diagnosis. But no, I believe the previous owner that the car has recently been serviced and no problems were revealed. "Honey," Kyle exclaimed when he saw her, "how are you feeling?" "I'm fine now," she reassured him. "The doctors say it's a miracle I didn't suffer any serious injuries in the fall. However, it could have ended much more sadly, if not for the help of a concerned person." "What kind of person?" Kyle asked. "Did he leave any contacts? We should thank him." "Thank him? I don't know. He looked like a vagrant, but he didn't leave anything. In fact, he left so fast he forgot his stuff." Poor guy, Kyle sympathized. Then all the more reason to find him. Knowing her fiance's stubbornness, she didn't argue with him, though she didn't want to bother a man who'd made it so clear that he didn't want any more attention. But it was impossible to change Kyle's mind. He had taken up the search for the unknown drifter with enviable enthusiasm. He even drove to that ill-fated bridge and searched the neighborhood for the stranger. In addition, connected all his many connections, and in the end, it gave the result. It turned out that near the scene of the incident were installed KEKT cameras, and Kyle managed to get footage from them. As it turned out, the stranger walked along the bridge often and quite often accompanied by a large and shaggy dog. On some of the shots was quite well seen the man's face. Moreover, he always came from the same direction. That seemed to be enough information for the restless Kyle, armed with several printouts of the camera footage. He went to the bridge again and tried to repeat the part of the tramp's route that he knew. And when he finally lost the trail, he turned to the people. Some passers-by on the street undoubtedly recognized the man with a large and, according to their assurances, very kind dog. However, no one could pinpoint where he lived. Kyle didn't give up. Again and again he came to the neighborhood and asked passers-by. Each time he had a small bag with him. As a thank you, he decided to buy the vagrant a new jacket. It seemed to him especially urgent, considering that winter was just around the corner. But no one had been able to point out to him the exact location of the tramp. Perhaps 3 weeks of fruitless searching would have cooled the ardor of any other man. But not Kyle. His failures only encouraged him to continue his search with more and more enthusiasm. After all, it wasn't long before his own wedding. And now, finally, his efforts were rewarded. Once again arriving at the place, he was surprised to see a big, black, shaggy dog. It was the same one he had seen on the videotapes many times before. Even though all the other dogs looked the same to him, this one he would recognize out of 1,000. Standing next to the animal was its owner, A young man about the same age as Kyle, only very thin, a walking skeleton. His clothes, just a light windbreaker over his shoulders, emphasized this feeling. It wasn't May or August. Kyle walked straight toward the strange man, wondering how best to start the conversation. He still felt that the successful outcome of the search was, if not his own doing, then certainly a coincidence. But as it turned out, he was wrong. The stranger spoke first, and not in a very friendly manner. "I take it you've been looking for him here for weeks, showing pictures to people and asking about me?" "Yes, I am," Kyle said. He was so taken aback by what was happening that all the phrases he'd prepared had slipped out of his head. He didn't know how to react to such a cold reception, and he felt, if not threatened by the tramp, then certainly unfriendly. "And why, may I ask?" continued the stranger. "I needed you," said Kyle, who had regained his composure. "You saved my fiancée, Jennifer. You remember, don't you? A woman fell off a bridge into the river with her car. You pulled her out and gave her first aid. That's something you don't forget." The stranger's tone softened a little. "Let's go and talk, if that's what you want. You're not going to find this place very cozy, but that's the way it is." Kyle got the impression that the drifter wanted to get out of the crowded place as quickly as possible. It was consistent with what he'd seen on the cameras, though. The man avoided large crowds and walked his dog mostly when there wasn't a soul on the streets. While the businessman was pondering what such secrecy could mean, the man and his dog led him through some dark back alleys. However, it did not take long to wade through them. In about 10 minutes, they came to a house in the countryside which looked abandoned, and that was where they were headed. "Are you hiding from someone?" Kyle couldn't help his curiosity. "Why would you say that?" His companion's response was a little harsh. "No, I'm just..." Kyle hesitated, then changed the subject. "What's your name?" "Andre." "I'm Kyle, nice to meet you. I brought you something. No offense, but you left your jacket on the bridge. I thought you weren't too rich to throw things away." He handed Andre a package with his gift. He did not refuse, accepted it calmly, only dryly throwing, "Thank you." They were silent for a while. Kyle looked at the house, as empty and abandoned on the inside as it was on the outside. The only indication that someone lived there was a pile of rags, and in the corner, the dog that the makeshift bed seemed to be for had piled up on top of it. "Listen, you can't live like this," Kyle mumbled, dumbfounded. "I know it wasn't a good life. You must have some serious problems. Let me help you." Andrew shook his head in the negative. The conversation had obviously reached an impasse. One of them was clearly unwilling to make contact. The other had no idea what to do about it. There was an awkward silence, interrupted only by the strange sounds coming from the dog. He was doing something in his corner, not paying attention to people. "At least come to the wedding," Kyle tried again. "It's in a few days. But don't worry about clothes or anything. I'll buy and pay for everything. Just come. I think Jennifer will be pleased." "Yeah, well, who am I going to leave the dog with?" Andrew muttered. "Well, if it's really a problem, there are ways to solve it. You know, the hotel lounge. I've heard that a private person can temporarily take the animal in. But honestly, I don't think it's a problem for him to be alone for a few hours. After all, he wasn't with you when you rescued Jennifer." The conversation went on like this for quite some time. Andrew made up the most ridiculous excuses not to go to the wedding. Kyle, in turn, was getting into the same state of excitement that kept him from stopping his search for the mysterious stranger. After a while, he was ready to argue into the night, just to convince his opponent. And the latter, apparently realizing this, finally gave up. "But all right," he said. "I'll be there, but not for long." Kyle feared he was just saying that to get him off his back, and when the day came, Andrew would simply not show up at the restaurant, return all the things he'd bought, apologize, and say he couldn't make it. The dog got sick or something ridiculous like that. He was so unsure of the guest's presence that he didn't even bother to inform Jennifer. Figured if he showed up, it would be a nice surprise. Otherwise, the bride would have no reason to be upset on her wedding day, unless she was given hope of something pleasant. Nevertheless, Andrew did show up, He kept modestly away from the general fun, did not talk to anyone, and answered all questions briefly in one-word answers. But he did show up. Apparently, he was such a man that he couldn't break his word. At that moment, Kyle had even more respect for the strange drifter, and everything seemed to be going well. Except that he noticed that the bride, who had been cheerful and contented with her life since morning, had fallen into either despondency or some kind of reverie. No, of course she was smiling, chatting amiably with the guests and all that. But Kyle knew his beloved too well to know something wasn't going nicely. "Is everything okay with you?" he asked quietly, as soon as he had a chance to talk without being heard. "Why did you bring Andrew here?" she asked bluntly. Kyle hesitated. He'd probably expected any answer he could get, but not this one. "I thought you'd be happy to see him," he replied dazedly. "I am so glad, of course I am. But you see what's the matter? He's not happy to be here at all." "I don't know why." "No, I think I do. He's just a vagrant with no home of his own. Everyone here is rich, successful. How do you think he feels about that? He's been ripped out of his normal world, plunged into all this luxury to entertain the fiancée of a rich businessman, and then shoved back into his miserable life." "I don't think that's the point," Kyle argued seriously. "In fact, I offered him all kinds of help, and he wouldn't work for me. He wouldn't take the money, as if this miserable life suited him just fine. But you're right about one thing. He obviously didn't want to come here, and maybe I shouldn't have talked him into it so much." "I don't know why I was so insistent," Jennifer laughed. But she didn't have time to continue her thought. The Toastmaster had been entertaining the guests with some background and, by and large, without attracting the attention of the guests, suddenly decided that it wouldn't go on like that. Some silly contests and other entertainments requiring the obligatory participation of the public began. "And you, young man, why are you standing idle?" he asked suddenly, obviously addressing Andrew. He was ready to leave and decided that his conscience was clear. He had kept his promise, and now he could go home quietly without too many farewells. But now everyone's attention was drawn to him, and it was no longer possible to do so. Meanwhile, the Toastmaster continued. "And by the way, it has come to my attention that it was thanks to this young man that this wedding took place at all." Yes, that's right. After all, if the bride had drowned, then we all might have gathered, but certainly would not have had fun." "Did you dig something up?" Jennifer flared up, turning to her new husband. "Are you trying to save money again?" "No, actually, it was an embarrassment," Kyle replied. "I guess I should have, though, now that I look at it. It was actually recommended to me by someone I know. I guess there was something I didn't know about the specificity of their humor." "But what about you, young man?" Meanwhile, the Toastmaster continued. "Do not be shy, go. Congratulate the happy family that is being created right in front of our eyes." Andrew slowly, as if overcoming some physical obstacle, climbed onto the stage, took the microphone in his hands, turned it around, as if not knowing how exactly it should be used. And then he finally squeezed out a few platitudes, but then suddenly decided to present the newlyweds with a song of his own performance. The lyrics were lyrical, about love that knows no barriers, and Andrew's voice was surprisingly good, and he sang beautifully, sensually. When he finished, the audience met him with thunderous applause. At that moment he became embarrassed, as if he realized, quickly gave the microphone to the Toastmaster, left the stage, and soon left the celebration. Kyle, intrigued by the guest's strange behavior, nevertheless found the strength to leave him alone, and was rewarded for his patience in the most unexpected way. In just a week, the answers to all his questions found him. Not in the form he had expected, though. Kyle had already finished his current business and was about to leave work when his cell phone rang. When he looked at the screen, he wasn't surprised. It displayed the number of a very old acquaintance of the investigator for especially important cases, with whom they had not communicated for many years. Bad thoughts began to creep into his head. "Hello, Tom, I haven't heard from you in 100 years. Are you just calling, or is it business? We haven't talked." "Sure," a serious voice answered him. "But not so much that you forget that I don't call for nothing." Kyle sighed heavily. "But surely there's something I can do to help," he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Or am I suspected of something? If the latter was true, you wouldn't have called, you'd have come in person." Yeah, that's right. Look, it's about your recent wedding. One of the guests, actually. Kyle's heart sank. He had little doubt which guest he was talking about. A variety of thoughts began to creep into his head, from the fact that he'd been wrong to find this tramp and invite him to the wedding to the certainty that Andrew couldn't be involved in anything criminal. Well, he did not look like a hardened criminal, especially such that he was interested in investigators dealing with particularly serious crimes. You see, a video of a young man singing a touching love song is spread everywhere, his interlocutor continued. It has become very popular, and frankly speaking, deservedly so. Even I got a kick out of it, although it would seem that's not the point. We are interested in the performer, and on what occasion are you interested in him? But actually, I can't tell you that, answered the investigator. You just found someone to make a fool of. Well, listen, he is a suspect in a very old and serious case. Although, of course, it may not be him, but I'm pretty sure I can't be wrong. It was a high-profile case. Maybe you've heard of it. Anyway, there was a helicopter carrying gold from the mines up north. And this is your guest. Worked there as a pilot. Worked well for a long time, no complaints. Except on one of the flights, something went wrong. There was a terrible accident. The helicopter went down. Everyone on board is dead. Well, not all of them. They found 3 bodies, and the crew was 4 people. They've all been identified. Only the pilot was missing. Quite a lot of gold was missing, and you think that the pilot killed them all and escaped with the gold. Why would he do that? Kyle clarified. But I can't think of any other theory. In fact, I wanted to ask you this. How could we find him and talk to him? He must be a friend of yours, you know. But you know me. If he's innocent, he's got nothing to fear. Maybe it's not even the same person. It's very easy to find out nowadays. Yeah, Kyle thought irritably. You'll tell me anything to get me to give you the information you want. I can't help you with that, he said. Not that he's my friend. No contact. Where does he live? I have no idea. And in that case, how did he end up at your wedding? The investigator inquired ingratiatingly. Yes, by pure chance. You see, what's the matter? Just a month before the wedding, he saved his wife. She naturally got into an accident, flew the car into the river, and he pulled her out, pumped her up. So we invited him to thank him, so to speak. But he came. And Nancy gave it to Tony. Well, we'll check it out. And you, if you find out anything. Sure, Kyle answered briefly and hung up. He paced around the office, unsure of what he should do. What wasn't adding up in his head? For one thing, Andrew had made a very good impression on him. And it wasn't just the fact that he'd saved Jennifer, though that was important, of course. But would an experienced killer jump into cold water to help a complete stranger and risk being discovered? No, he'd just walk on by without any unpleasant consequences. Besides, gold, like you, Andrew, is vagrancy. And if, according to the investigator's version, he stole valuables worth a huge amount of money, it would have been enough to become a whole new person. Forge documents and go somewhere overseas and live a lifetime of luxury and self-indulgence. And again, no. Lives in some abandoned rundown house, along with an obviously picked up dog. There's that dog again. By the way, they say dogs look like their owners. And this animal, for all its fierce appearance, was a calm and completely harmless creature. But there were, of course, arguments in favor of the other option. One argument, to be exact, was Andrew's strange behavior. He was clearly hiding from someone, probably from some serious people. Why not the police? And on the other hand, who says that the police are always right and never prosecute the innocent? In the end, Kyle decided he had only one right course of action. Go to Andrew's house right now and talk to him in person. Ask him what was going on, get some answers, and then decide what to do next. Somehow he didn't feel any danger to himself at all. Even though he'd been told that this man was probably a cold-blooded killer, he must not have wanted to believe it. As soon as he approached the house, however, Kyle realized he was too late. A huge black dog was lunging in front of the dilapidated building, seemingly distraught with grief. Andrew was nowhere to be found. Apparently, the cops had gotten ahead of him. Well, they certainly had a lot more resources to search than he did. The first time he'd looked for a strange stranger, Kyle had approached the dog and affectionately said a few meaningless words to him. The dog looked at him cross-eyed, growled menacingly, but then sniffed and obviously recognized him, came right up to him with sad eyes, sat down near his feet, and demanded to be stroked on the back of his neck. "Don't worry, cheer up," Kyle said. "Let's get your master out." He opened the car door and made an inviting gesture. The dog looked at him incredulously, but jumped in. On the way out, Kyle dialed his wife's number, wondering how he could best explain all this to her. But nothing good came to mind. Indeed, Kyle was a half hour behind schedule. By the time he got the call from an old acquaintance, the police already knew the approximate area in which to search for the suspect. Combing through it and finding the abandoned house wasn't too difficult for them. Andrew had gone with them without resistance, asking only to be allowed to find someone to watch the dog, but even that was denied. At the police station, they immediately led him to a stern-looking interrogation. The investigator was clearly set against him. Andrew knew this type of person well. He had no goal of getting to the truth. He already had a picture in his head of what had happened, and if some facts contradict it, so much the worse for the facts. "Peter's Andrew Valerievich?" The investigator asked him sternly. "Yes, that's me," reluctantly admitted the suspect. What's the point of denying it? Saying that he just looks alike? He was confused with someone, does not know anything. Maybe 20 or 30 years ago it would have worked, but not now. DNA will quickly prove that he's the pilot who went missing after the helicopter crash, and it's only going to get worse. "Andrew Valerievich, do you understand why we asked you here?" "But I wouldn't use the word," invited Andrew said caustically, "but yes, I understand the reason for your interest in my person. Do you think I'm responsible for the death of 3 people crashed in the helicopter and the loss of a large amount of gold?" "Yes, well, you see, it's not difficult at all." The investigator suddenly smiled, already presenting another star on his epaulets. "It's good that you cooperate with the investigation. It will count for something." "Wait a minute," Andrew objected. "I didn't confess to anything. I just stated the charges you could have brought against me, at your request, by the way. But I didn't say I actually did it." "That's interesting," said the investigator. "Then how do you explain what happened?" "Well, quite simply," Andrew replied. "I was set up. There was no gold in the helicopter. We were transporting some garbage under the guise of it, but I found out about it after the crash. The bags burst open, and I saw what was really in them. The helicopter was damaged just before it went down. Apparently, they must have counted on someone being alive to take the fall, or some escaped convicts if they all died. It's the North, rough country, lots of criminals." "It sounds very plausible," said the investigator, not hiding his skepticism. "But if you are not guilty of anything, why have you been hiding all this time? Why not come to the police at once and tell everything as it was?" "Well, I must say, the crash didn't go without a trace for me," Andrew answered. "I was injured a lot, lost my memory. Some locals found me, took me to the hospital. I lay there for a couple of months. I came out of there with no money, no ID. Who was I from? I couldn't remember anything, and I didn't know who needed me. So it turned out I was left with only one way out. I wandered around for a long time, changed cities. Then a dog came to me. That's when I started to remember. I don't know what that has to do with it. Maybe it doesn't. But the point is, it's been 2 years since my memory finally came back. Where would I go? Who'd believe me? I didn't want to go to jail, and I'd gotten used to the vagabond life. And I would have lived normally, not bothering anyone, if it wasn't for the wedding. That damned wedding." Of course, the investigator did not believe Andrew, and he went to the detention center to await trial, the outcome of which no one doubted. He even seemed to accept his fate and was more concerned about the dog. But when the capture service arrived at his old house to take the dog to the shelter, they found no one, though had just finished his questioning and was about to call his old acquaintance Kyle again. But he was beaten to it. He turned on his cell phone, which he always turned off while working, and it was ringing off the hook with messages about the persistent attempts to reach him, followed by another call. "Hello again," the investigator stretched into the receiver. "Why are you worried about your fool? about whose place of residence you know nothing. This is a deliberate misleading of the investigation. What were you thinking? The cameras already show everything perfectly, he continued. And how did you look for him? And how did you meet him? Look, Tony, I don't believe Andrew could have killed anyone, Kyle said bluntly. You don't have to believe that. The facts are there. There's no conclusive evidence that he's innocent. The version he gave me is ridiculous. Do you have any proof of his guilt? Kyle asked. Well, think about it. Would a killer risk his life to save a stranger? People change, the investigator said philosophically, but that doesn't absolve them of responsibility for past crimes. Well, and the gold, he must have a lot of money. If he really committed a theft, what do you suspect him of? Why is he living like a bum in some abandoned shack? Who knows? Maybe he stole it, but he doesn't know where to sell it or what to do with it. He didn't know. He's basically just a working man, didn't work with jewelry. That much money can make a man go crazy. It happens. And he got nothing out of it in the end. So much trouble, Kyle interrupted him. I'll give you some advice, though. Instead of trying to talk me down, talk to your friend. Kill him. Tell him that cooperating with the investigation is the best option for him. Tell him to tell it like it is. He'll repent. Show him where he hid the gold. I'm sure he's got it somewhere. He'll get credit for it. He'll get the minimum, and then he'll be out on parole for good behavior. That's the best option. What can I get you? I'll think about it, Kyle said dryly. He hung up the phone without saying goodbye. His insides were churning with rage. Now he was absolutely certain that poor Andrew had done nothing wrong. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it was that punishable. What proof do they have that he did it? Isn't there a presumption of innocence? He didn't take the wise advice, of course. Instead, he talked to some acquaintances and hired the best lawyer for Andrew. Of course, it had cost a lot of money. Nevertheless, he felt responsible for the unfortunate drifter. After all, it was Kyle's fault that he had come to his wedding, where he was eventually discovered. The lawyer turned out to be smart and well-versed in his work. At the trial, he convincingly argued that there was no reason to consider one version worse than the other. There was no evidence, witnesses, recordings from surveillance cameras in those places where the crime occurred. In addition, the version that the prosecution provided also had many unresolved problems. For example, how Andrew would have transported such a large amount of gold alone and hidden it. He wouldn't have had time to do it, given how quickly the scene of the tragedy arrived. Plus, the suspect went, and the fact that before the incident he was on a good account with his superiors. Responsible, hardworking, reliable. Albeit with some difficulty, Andrew was exonerated. He walked out of the courtroom a free man with no problems with the law, except he still had no home, no job, and no assets. How was he supposed to start this new life of his? He had no idea. We should find one for starters, he said aloud, but more to himself than to anyone around him. Don't, Kyle snapped back. I took it from us the minute they took you away. I thought I'd have no trouble. Turned out to be a good animal. Obedient, doesn't run around the house, doesn't shit. You bet, Andrew smiled. I didn't just pick him up. I raised him the best I could, and it worked out great. I'll tell you. But think about it. Where are you going to take him? Will you wander the streets again? Or are you going to go back to your summer house? It's going to fall right on your heads. It's no good. But what else is left? Tell you what, come work for me. I can't pay much yet, but I'll make enough to live on. Plus, I'll rent you an apartment as an employee. That's good practice. We'll find one where they'll let your dog in. It's kind of embarrassing. You've helped me so much already, Andrew mumbled. I've only gotten you out of the story I got you into so far, Kyle countered. And I still haven't thanked you for saving Jennifer's life. And believe me, I value her life very highly. I don't even know how to do much of anything. Andrew was still hesitant. Unless I can fly a helicopter. And that's probably not very good anymore. Skills are lost as machines improve. You'd have to retrain all the time. And I don't think you need a pilot. Well, I don't need a pilot. But a driver, why not? I'm not in a position to turn the steering wheel myself. Can you drive a car? I do. I just need to renew my license, but that's no problem. And that was the deal. Andrew and the dog, as Kyle had promised, moved into a spacious apartment not far from the office. The salary, according to the newly minted driver, was even higher than he deserved. In short, life began to get better. He hardly even remembered what he had left behind. There was only one thing that made him sad. Once upon a time long ago, he had a fiancée. Where is she now? With whom? He didn't know. She'd probably given up on him as soon as he'd been blamed for the helicopter crash. He didn't blame her, but he was in no hurry to reconnect. Why? She's probably got her own life, and his feelings for her had long since faded. However, memories more and more often led Andrew to think that he lacked a woman's warmth. By duty, he drove Kyle everywhere, but primarily to various business negotiations. Usually he waited for his boss in the car, but sometimes he was offered a seat somewhere near the reception desk. As a rule, he politely declined. He felt a bit awkward in posh interiors of expensive offices or fashionable restaurants, but once he decided to agree. The thing is that to the invitation. It was this woman who captivated Andrew that day, when he didn't even have time for breakfast. He was engaged in some mundane and completely unnecessary conversation with his secretary, when a woman, the future business partner of his boss, came out of the meeting room on her own business. By the corner of his eye, he managed to notice the third participant of these negotiations and froze at half a word. Of course, time had done its work, but he could not fail to recognize these people, especially the woman. The very woman with whom he had spent so many days and nights, and whose face he knew better than his own. After all, she had been his fiancée then, in his past life. But her companion in that life was his immediate superior, who had sent Andrew on that ill-fated flight. How vividly Andrew remembered that he was not the one who was supposed to fly that day. But the boss asked him very much, literally begged him, saying that the task was too important, and he could not entrust it to just anyone, only to the best employee. Now it became clear that the employee was either to be killed or imprisoned for life. It seems that these two would be satisfied with either option. Andrew had no doubts about who had set him up with that shipment and who had gotten all the gold they were trying to pin on him. Besides, he had seen the couple trading and exchanging some jewelry when they came here to Los Angeles. In short, they were clearly in a romantic relationship. What he hadn't seen then was their faces. But now that he recognized them, everything fell into place. In front of him were the culprits of all his troubles. Andrew took exactly as long as it took Jennifer's ex-fiancée to complete the business she had left the office for. He had literally burst into the room after her, and without realizing what he was doing, he had attacked his former boss with his fists, shouting accusations and insults. It took a lot of effort for Kyle to pull his driver away from the potential partners. "Is this how you guys negotiate now?" the injured man inquired. "We certainly didn't agree on everything, but not to this extent." "I apologize for this terrible incident," Kyle Chief began. "You don't have to have any dealings with them," Andrew interrupted him. "They're crooks and murderers besides." "You'll have to believe me." "Calm down, son," Kyle said. As he left the office, he added reluctantly, "We'll deal with you later." Andrew obeyed. Back in the car, he tried to calm the trembling in his hands and wipe the tears from his eyes. The chief returned 10 minutes later and was, to say the least, not in the best of spirits. "The negotiations are blown," he almost shouted. "I had so counted on these people being very respectable. By the way, they were supposed to invest in my project. I hope I was able to persuade them to consider it after all. Still, nothing is guaranteed. Explain to me what's gotten into you." Nervous and stammering, occasionally breaking down into hysterical sobs, Andrew tried to tell me exactly what had happened. Kyle listened to him without interrupting, but, as it seemed to the driver, didn't really believe his words. "And you're absolutely sure it's definitely them?" he asked skeptically. "I've spent so many nights in the same bed with this woman. Pardon me. Wouldn't I recognize it? And the boss hasn't changed much." "Well, let's say," Kyle said slowly. "But are you sure they're the ones who set you up? Who else?" "It's all there on the surface." That's what an investigator I know used to say about a man who was later found completely innocent in a court of law. Does that ring a bell? "That's not the same thing," Andrew said. "I think it's the same thing." Kyle cut him off. "The same baseless accusations based on your own prejudices. We don't know what happened to that helicopter, period. Furthermore, I can certainly understand your feelings. but we also don't know if she really cheated on you, even though you're now convinced otherwise. But no, Andrew began. But cut off Kyle, this conversation is over. And if you ever allow yourself to pull a stunt like this again, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to fire you. Friendship is friendship, but I'm not going to let anyone ruin my business. For a while it was as if they had decided to forget what had happened. As before, Andrew drove the chief to negotiations, but he never saw his former fiancée or her new husband again. He even allowed himself to hope that Kyle had heeded his words after all, and decided to look for more reliable partners. Very soon he had to find out that he was sorely mistaken. One Monday morning, when he had habitually picked up his boss to drive him to work, he had found only Jennifer at home. To say she was upset was an understatement. She was in a state of near panic. Went to negotiate out of town somewhere Friday night. What negotiation? Andrew was taken aback. I mean, he let me go early on Friday. Who drove him? He drove himself, Jennifer said. He said he didn't want you there. Jesus, Andrew whispered, starting to realize. Wasn't it with the Vasquez couple he's had talks with them? Jennifer retorted, looking at him with some hopefulness even. I've contacted them before. They say it went well and he went home the same day. They never saw him again. And he didn't make it home either. For the next few days, Andrew, along with Kyle's father, literally lived at Jennifer's house and supported her as best he could. He didn't know how to tell her the terrible truth, the reality of which he was almost certain. It was unlikely they would ever see Kyle alive again. His suspicions were confirmed by the fact that the chief's firm had somehow ended up in the Vasquez family's control. Allegedly, Kyle signed some kind of power of attorney for them. And now, while he was missing, it was they who were supposed to run the business. The only thing Andrew didn't know was how to prove his suspicions. For a while, though, he had bigger problems. The very secretary who sat in the office at Vasquez's pointed at him as a possible culprit of the disappearance of the chief. She said if he was lashing out at people out of the blue, maybe he killed the chief. And then there's the old accusation. The court acquitted him, of course, but it left a residue. All the police wanted to do was close the case as quickly as possible. It was Jennifer's intercession that saved Andrew, and also the fact that he had a great relationship with his neighbors, which he kindly always helped in one way or another. Immediately, several people, having learned of his distress, agreed to testify. Many saw him walking with his dog on the evening of the ill-fated Friday. So even those charges against him had to be dropped. Nevertheless, Andrew had to spend a few days in the police station. When he came out, he was surprised to find that he could not pull himself together. Finally, he was able to tell her his version of events so they could figure out together what to do next. Jennifer believed him unconditionally, but had no idea how to prove it herself. Besides, as horrible as it might sound, she had bigger problems to deal with. She had to fight for their business somehow, so she wouldn't be left without a livelihood, especially since Jennifer wasn't just responsible for herself anymore. Shortly before Kyle's disappearance, the couple had learned that they were expecting a child. I understand something about these things. Of course, she shared with Andrew, but still not as well as I'd like. Most of the people who could help have only communicated with Kyle. He still has all the contacts. So maybe you and Victor should reach out, Andrew suggested to her. You seem to have a good relationship with the firm. They apparently don't, but they have experience and connections. That's right. Jennifer slapped her forehead with the palm of her hand. How did I not realize that right away? Come on, you've got so much on your plate right now. So they divided up the duties. Jennifer, with the help of Kyle's parents, began suing Vasquez over the business. Andrew, on the other hand, went in search of his missing boss. He simply drove every road he could find in the area where the negotiations had taken place, interviewing people, reviewing camera footage that some of the concerned owners of roadside establishments agreed to show him. It took about a month to get on the trail. The camera lens of one of the cafes still got the car he was looking for. Now the directions of the search were clearer. Andrew searched literally every millimeter within a radius of several kilometers from this place, and finally he succeeded. He found a remote pond somewhere on the edge of the forest. The place was quite picturesque and would have attracted tourists if not for the location. It was too far not only from civilization, but even from remote villages and dacha settlements. Apparently, that's why the criminals chose this corner. Instead of crowds of vacationers on the surface of the water with sadly visible flooded car, Kyle, it wasn't the first time Andrew had dived into an icy body of water. Then again, he hadn't hesitated for a second before doing so. The car was empty, but miraculously the video recorder was intact. He waded ashore, clutching the precious find in his hands. Of course, it's not certain that the tape will serve as proof, but now there was at least some hope. In any case, a flooded car is something. At least now the police would have to move to find out what had happened to its owner. With these thoughts, Andrew called the police. While he waited for them to arrive, he decided to watch the tape recorder. It was hard to do, and the feelings after watching it were very ambiguous. On the one hand, Andrew now knew for sure that he had in his hands the perfect proof of Vasquez's guilt. It was the former chief sat behind the wheel of this car for the last time, while on the back seat was lying tied-up owner. What's more, it turns out Kyle's recorder was somehow very advanced. It recorded audio too. So basically the perps were having fun discussing all their machinations on tape. Fortunately, it cut off shortly before the car, apparently together with its helpless owner, went into the pond. We should be happy. The criminals will finally be punished, except it's not going to bring Kyle back. And if he were less stubbornly self-righteous, he wouldn't be Kyle. This whole story would have turned out differently. With a heavy heart, Andrew gave the tape to the police and drove to Jennifer's house. Now that the police have all the evidence they can get, it's going to turn out that you were arrested, convicted, and sent to jail for a very long time, and not just for Kyle's death. In fact, in that tape they discussed their previous crime as well, as Andrew believed. He himself had continued to live with Jennifer, and afterward with her young son. The boy must have considered him as his father from the first days. After some time, the couple decided to get married. At first, just to avoid explaining to everyone how it happened that they lived together and raised a child, but are neither spouses, nor even just in love. But over time, their friendship, fueled by common troubles, began to grow into something more. When their son went to school, they were already beyond any doubt full-fledged spouses. All the troubles and sorrows were not that forgotten, but remained only a pale shadow in the distant past. Now both of them were absolutely happy, and their family had their own traditions. For example, every Sunday they went to the park together with their son and an elderly but still vigorous dog. On one of these walks, they noticed a beggar throwing a begging bowl. Before they could think of anything, two things happened at once. First, the son, who grew up a kind and sympathetic guy, came up to the poor man to give him his bun. Secondly, the dog, noticing the vagrant, did not ignore him like all strangers. No, he came wagging his tail and tried to lick his face. That's when Andrew managed to get a proper look at him. "Kyle," he exclaimed, amazed. Jennifer was dumbfounded as well. "Do you know me?" the beggar asked hopefully, petting the dog. "I apologize for asking such a question. I woke up one day on the shore of a pond very far from here. What happened before that? I don't know." Andrew couldn't find the strength to answer, tears glistening in his eyes. He rushed to his old friend and put his arms around him. "It's all right," he said. "We'll help you remember. It's so good to have you alive." Now it was Andrew's turn to rent a place for Kyle to live and assist him in any way he could. Eventually, in familiar surroundings, the memory began to slowly return, and then they all ran into a problem that no one had thought of. Kyle, only after realizing who he was, realized that his wife was now with someone else, who was also raising his son as his own. And naturally, this was a hard blow to him. For some time, he even led himself into all sorts of bad behavior, drinking, came to Andrew's house, made ugly scenes. The spouses did not fight and did not condemn him. On the contrary, continued to support. And even the son could somehow explain that the uncle has a difficult period in life, but it will pass, and everything will be as good as before. And it did. And just a couple months later, one day, Kyle showed up on their doorstep, completely sober and looking very guilty. "Friends, I'm sorry," he said simply. "I've been gone for almost 8 years. Of course, you've had your own lives going on. I shouldn't have reacted so strongly to it." "That's all right," Andrew replied. "It's all right now, isn't it? You're back with us." "Yes," Jennifer added. "You've always been a little impulsive, so it's no surprise. We've been waiting for you to come to your senses. There's only one serious question." "What's that?" Kyle wondered. "Business," Andrew said briefly. We've made a lot of progress over the years, but at least a third of what we have is rightfully yours." Oh, Kyle said, "Well, you and your business. I don't want to get a quiet job as a janitor or something. I'm done being an entrepreneur for the rest of my life. It's a dangerous business." In the end, they agreed that the couple would send Kyle a certain amount of money every month and thus return to him as part of the business. That suited everyone. Kyle himself, tired of the hustle and bustle of city life, decided to go to the village. He found a suitable village, and surprisingly, there was even a house for sale. However, when he arrived to inspect it, the look of the structure seemed to him very depressing. A woman sitting in a wheelchair watched for a long time, and then she drove up and started a conversation. "I don't be too sure about this house," she said. "It looks so bad on the outside, and believe me, it's even worse on the inside. You can't tell how bad it is, and that's why they're selling it so cheap." "It's a shame," Kyle said. "I liked your village. I wanted to live here. I don't see any other houses for sale." "You know what?" Jennifer said. "The morning's the wiser. But where would you go at night now? Stay here. We'll figure out what to do in the morning." They got to talking to this woman, whose name was Jennifer too. She used to be a milkmaid. Yeah, she got hurt once by an out-of-control bull. Since then, she'd been living on her own with the help of kind neighbors. But of course, her house was in a bit of a state of disrepair. At first, Kyle helped out with little things. Then he decided to stay and did a full-scale renovation. Then he broke up the vegetable garden, and eventually he found the right doctors and paid for Jennifer's expensive surgery to repair her lower spine. Then another 6 months of hard rehabilitation, during which he was always there for her. And finally, she was able to take her first step. The farm, meanwhile, was growing. Kyle bought the little house with the lot and attached it to Jennifer's house. He started to set up the farm, started some livestock, even hired employees. In short, he went back into business, but in a different business. And a couple of years later, there was a noisy village wedding, to which, of course, invited Andrew and Jennifer and their children, and even the dog. And the bride was already dancing with the groom, even better than many young and healthy people.